various outstanding representatives from all over the place, and try to find some sort of common theme to draw down or drill down to a specific topic. And I think that one specific theme is how the authoritarians today are using technology that for the most part the West has created against us, against the West. So that would be the overarching theme of this conversation, and we'll go into details. And please do prepare to ask questions. I think you will have very interesting responses from our panelists. And just to very briefly introduce Gustaf Göthberg, is a member of the Swedish Parliament. Scott Carpenter represents Jigsaw. Mr. Steve Capus is the CEO and President and the CEO of RFERL, and Shota Gvineria represents the lovely EPRC. So let's get started, and let's start from you, Steve, to give us an overview of, not specifically from the RFE perspective, but you in this large media hat. How do you see this problem that I just described? How are the authoritarians using technology against us? It's a very broad question. You can take it wherever you want.
Well, it's why we exist, right? I mean, I've been touched by so many people at this conference have come up to me and they've said, you know, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I sat with my grandmother and listened to your programs. It was a lifeline. And my response to that is I always get chills when somebody tells me that sort of personal story. But then I also say that our mission now is as vital as it's ever been. And that's a strong statement given our long 70-plus year history. The challenges are immense, and there's technology that is thrown against us, but there's also legislative actions that are taken. Depending on where you're talking about, our people, independent journalists get labeled as enemies of the state, extremists, political activists, foreign agents, and I'm here to tell you none of it's true. And so our organization is a journalistic organization. We're not out in the streets calling for change. That's not our role. But what we have as a very strong tool, a very effective tool, is we are purveyors of the truth. And it is clearly a threat to people like the Russian leader, to any number of different dictators, autocrats. You know, they view what we do as a threat, and therefore they use every means at their disposal. They block our sites, they harass our people, they imprison our journalists. And I will say now, we just had really welcome news that one of our journalists who was imprisoned in Russia came home after 10 months behind bars. She came home just a few weeks ago. Also Kremasheva, and we're thrilled to welcome her back to Prague. But we still have 3 journalists who, as we speak, are in prison simply because they are journalists. And so 2 are being held right now in Belarus, and 1 in Russian-controlled Crimea. It's time to bring them home. But this underscores the lengths at which people will go to silence voices of the truth, political opponents. The good news is, it's impossible to silence all opposition, all dissenting viewpoints, all religions. Our organization is based around the support of those fundamental freedoms. And where they're threatened, we go in. We have got to go in with a dedication because it's very tough work. We're having some success these days, and we can't give up.
Steve, I'll just follow up just very briefly before I move to Shota to talk about Georgia specifically. But you mentioned the skill or the profession of journalism. They cannot silence all truth. From your perspective, do people, large, populace societies, do they still trust journalists in this age of technological development, social media, etc.?
Well, it's a broad question, but I would say that at the core of it is reputational issues matter. If we lose that trust, if we lose the relevance if we choose stories that are not important to the huge numbers of audiences, and this is a good time to remind everybody, we operate in 23 different countries, 27 different languages. We're all across Eastern Europe, into the Caucasus. We reach down into Central Asia and all the way into Iran. And those audiences turn to us.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a good example. Our base audience inside Russia, we are still reaching people effectively inside Russia. It's not easy, but it still happens. We've seen this year, during when Navalny met his death at the hands of his Russian jailers, and when the Ukrainians launched the incursion into Kursk, we saw huge spikes of audience activity engaging with our content inside Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And that says to me that, yes, there's still
trust,
think that
yes.
we have a relevance and that we can still provide something that is different from the state-sponsored propaganda that they're spoon-fed every day.
Yeah. So there is need for truthful information.
There is absolutely a need.
Shota, let's come to you now and talk about, as I call it, ground zero for this purposes. How do you view the disinformation manipulation of information manipulation from the Georgian perspective? What's happening here?
Well, yeah, I think first we have to start from a little bit bigger picture and acknowledge the fact that disinformation and information manipulation is just one tool within the broader hybrid warfare strategy. And if you look at Georgia, Georgia is the most unfortunate, I would say, and successful case of how one can lose hybrid warfare. And what Russia utterly failed to achieve in Ukraine through weapons and missiles and military instrument of power, it successfully achieved or is achieving here in Georgia. So that's a textbook case study, and that's what I teach at some of the PME institutions now, how hybrid warfare pattern of the Russian Federation works. And that's very consistent, by the way, that's not new. So there was active measures. By the way, if you have not done so, please Google Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov is a KGB defector. He defected from Soviet Union to Canada, and he revealed the patterns of how KGB is actually implementing the active measures strategy in different Western countries. And he had 4 stages there: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. If you look how Russia's hybrid warfare actually came about through this changed pattern of active measures, you see the same 4 stages. You see how Russia creates a problem, then invites everybody to negotiate that problem around the table and escalates at the same time. So everybody is scared, you know, of this Third World War or the nuclear exchange or escalation, generally speaking. Then Russia gains some sorts of concessions, and then it digests that concession and repeats it in different point in time, different geography. And this is how Russia has been extending its influences in what it calls its near abroad, or the sphere of exclusive influence. And the sphere of exclusive influence in this, for this matter, can be very easily explained as, you know, countries losing ability to take independent policy decisions. So they know what's best for their regimes, they know what's best for their countries and national interests, but they cannot act upon those, and they only can do what Russia wants them to do. It's a Belarus kind of model, is a fait accompli of sphere of exclusive influence. And Russia has been using this wide range of non-military instruments of power in this country for the last decades, and last decade or so very effectively. And now we're in this point in time when it really doesn't matter what Georgian Dream wants or what Georgia's national interests are. They don't care about what Georgian people want. What matters is that there is something that Russia, Kremlin wants to accomplish here, and they find ways how to do that. They set the objectives, and then they choose very carefully what is the right tool for achieving that particular objective. So now, because they see that the main problem in this country for them, from Russian perspective, is the public opinion, which is strongly pro-Western, pro-European, pro-NATO, pro-American, then what is the best tool to influence public opinion? You cannot influence public opinion through occupation. You can hold the land through occupation, but if you want to change how people think and act, then information is the key tool for you. And they master these patterns,
And
starting from active measures up until now. And that's what's happened.
Georgia is one of the test grounds,
Right.
I would assume. Gustaf, let's come to you now from a broader perspective, particularly about hindering or ensuring that the authoritarians are not ahead of the democracies in this battle. Do you think the West is doing enough to tackle this issue? And if you don't, what would you like to see?
Well, thank you, and thanks also for the invitation to be here in lovely Tbilisi, and also a special thanks to Nino Evgenis, not only for hosting us and having us here, but also for handing out sun lotion to a Swede before this panel. Very much appreciated from my point of view. This is a brilliant panel, and I think that we've heard some very interesting things. And the answer to your question, Ia, is that of course we don't understand. Or maybe we do understand, but we're not doing too much. We had a brilliant panel on China here before, and I recall some of us were at the Lennart Merieux conference in 2019, when then Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen of Germany was in a panel with the President of Georgia, and then Defense Minister von der Leyen said that she thought it would be very good for the European Union to have a China policy or a China strategy. And fast forward 5 years, she has been Commission President. We belong to the same European Party, so I really like her. It's not her fault, but we still don't really know how to deal with China, for example, and the authoritarianism that comes from China, also from a European Union perspective. So we're not really there, and from a Swedish perspective also. Last summer, in 2023, we had a very peculiar situation in Sweden because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there were a lot of people showing up burning the Holy Quran. And I mean, you can believe in coincidences sometimes, but in the midst of the discussions we had with Turkey about allowing us into NATO, all of a sudden, secret people who no one had ever heard of showed up outside the Turkish embassy in Stockholm and burning the Holy Quran. And that is not really a coincidence. And that made also the reaction from the Swedish society to allude to a discussion about cultural wars, about Islam in general, about Western culture, about whether or not we should infringe on our rights because we want to have the national security instead. And that is also a discussion that played in the hands to a man in the Kremlin. So we can see this also, but we're not really prepared to do it. In Sweden, I would say that when it comes to disinformation or cyber attacks or hybrid attacks and hacking and trying to get some compromise of politicians, we are rather well prepared. And also the Swedish military, for example, as Sweden is a NATO ally, is well prepared. But as was mentioned in the NATO panel also before, that when we joined NATO finally some months ago, it was very important for us to stress also in the political debate when we were talking about the civil aspects of everything, that it's not the Swedish armed forces joining NATO. It's Sweden as a country joining NATO. And that really brings up something else. I mean, are we as a society, with kids going to school, getting their only news from TikTok? Are they really there and being prepared for the things and the current developments around our local areas and our neighborhoods? Is the Swedish hospital system prepared for being member of NATO? Is the Swedish public broadcaster prepared for being a member of NATO as well? And that is really where we need to focus now, because we have the military thing really sorted out, but when it comes to the threats from authoritarian leadership, from dictators attacking the fundamentals of the society, we are not that prepared as we must, unfortunately. But we're getting there.
I think Scott's going to give us some responses or some answers how to prepare ourselves for that, right? So from the technological development, AI perspective, what do you think we should be doing better, and what do you think we're doing wrong in this regard?
Well, thank you. And before I get into the answer, I just wanted to thank Yuya. I also want to thank David Kramer and Nino for the invitation. This is my first time to visit Georgia, and it's just been a spectacular opportunity to be here. I also want to thank you for the sun. It's so warm and pleasant. And for the opportunity to get the suntan that I'm earning. I am earning right now.
So did you decide to stay in Georgia, or are you leaving?
I wish I could stay.
Okay.
I wish I could stay. I will be back.
Okay.
So the question's a good one. Our societies have been struggling with misinformation and disinformation since democracies were started in our respective countries. The challenge, of course, has been that the internet has vastly expanded the surfaces for us to consume information of any sort, and our established media has been disintermediated by other perspectives and other views, and various organizations that, you know, they're expert bloggers who are taking time and eyeballs away from straightforward news reporting, and that's all to the good. More information, more perspectives are okay. But the fact is that as the internet has exploded, it has meant that there are new surfaces in which actors who are very much interested in purveying false information, misleading information, are out there. And since I began at Google 13 years ago, this has been a focus. In the initial stages, it was based on the concept that ISIS was using the internet to radicalize people in Arab-speaking communities where there was very little in the way of content that could actually be surfaced that would contest the narratives that ISIS and others were presenting. So we learned a lot from those sorts of campaigns, and then, of course, the whole debates around 2016 and what happened in our elections. I happen to be on the board of the America for Bulgaria Foundation, and I learned that Bulgaria is like a test bed for a lot of tactics that are used there, and we were studying those tactics. So today, we have this thing you may have heard of called AI. Generative AI, large language models. And the fact is that large language models are able to produce information at scale very quickly. It's not that great for the most part, but it is powerful. And this is also the concept of deep fakes that I'm sure you've heard about as well, where you take a bit of video or you take some pictures and then you're able to create entirely new videos out of whole cloth or out of whole digits, and able to present them as something true, or at least create confusion around that information. And then the final version of that is related to audio, where you take a snippet of a person's voice and you're able to use it to create an entirely fake video of a phone, audio of a phone call or whatever. It's the last one that I'm actually most concerned about right now. I think there are a number of companies in the private sector that are having the ability to determine when something is a deep fake. I am not vouching for any of them, but it seems to me that this is an area where there's going to be an explosion of question about all of the information that we're receiving, and there should be. We as consumers need to be on guard against misleading misinformation. Please don't rely on the companies to fix this, or don't rely on your governments to tell you what is true and what is not true. So we as individuals have to be made more resilient to to this, and I do think technology can also be helpful with that, so maybe we can come
So
back to that.
to stay on the AI topic very
Yeah.
briefly before we move on to different topics. So you're saying that it's very dangerous, basically. The way the authoritarians can use AI is dangerous. So what is, in addition to the companies and potential algorithms that would detect the fake, what else are large companies like Google is doing to prevent this?
So a lot of what we're doing is on our surfaces where we do have a lot of video. So YouTube, where we're really thinking very deeply about how to get at this issue. So, and there's some promising work there. But it's that Vimeo or like some other video that's surfacing on a blog site somewhere that all of a sudden gets blown up, where society just has to be ready for something like that. So one of the things that we have been doing for a long time that we're really investing much more in is campaigns around creating and enhancing resilience. So focusing on the tactics that are most used in these types of campaigns, the emotional manipulation that people use, the creating whataboutism contexts, other means of manipulation, and trying at scale to surface those types of tools and tactics to our audiences, and also to do them with partners more locally. Jigsaw just finished a pre-bunking campaign in Ukraine, which was done with local influencers and local organizations on the ground, which managed to reach 79% of the population between 18 and 55, and it was had very positive results. And I think this is something that we can also scale. The more you sensitize the public, the more skeptical they are, the more likely they are to at least ask one or two questions before sharing the thing.
Mm-hmm. That's public education and access,
Essentially,
basically.
yes.
So Steve, I would like to come to you now, as we're talking about the access to information. You touched upon Russia briefly. You're very, of course, RFE is very influential and impactful in Ukraine, everything Ukraine war related, and other regions as well, of course. I'm curious about the Georgia part of it. As we all know, the Foreign Agent Transparency Law, which is frequently called the Russian law, not only Georgia, but pretty much everywhere, has been enacted. And RFE is funded from the outside sources. So what's RFE's position on registering as a foreign agent, and how do you think it's going to impact, the law is going to impact your operations here?
Well, we did not register, and we've taken the opinion and we've been advised that we do not believe that this law applies to us. That's not to say, though, that we're not concerned about it, and we're concerned not just for journalistic entities, but on all organizations that are threatened by this. We heard some talk yesterday about organizations deciding to register because they couldn't handle the fines that could potentially come from this. And I think that's a chilling effect. The work that's being done is not being done by any of these entities. It's not being done on behalf of a foreign power. It's being done on behalf of the people of Georgia. Right. And that's why it's viewed as a threat. That's why there's such political pressure right now to try to keep this isolated, keep these opinions to yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's dangerous. And we see it, you know, our organization, I told you where we operate, every month there's another effort somewhere to declare us an extremist organization, an undesirable organization, foreign agents, and there's a proliferation of a playbook that looks awfully similar to one that came out of Russia. And Belarus is going to extraordinary lengths these days to attempt to silence people. So there's undoubtedly an effort underway, and we're going to have to continue to stay agile and smart about how we approach it. I want to say two things. You mentioned Ukraine. Number one, we have more than 150 journalists who are on the ground in Ukraine right now. Many of them are proud Ukrainians, and I'm enormously proud of their efforts, really going back 10 years now, but especially over the last couple of years since the invasion. Our people are basically showing the world what's taking place inside Ukraine, and they're doing it with unbelievable professionalism. They're paying a very high price. It's dangerous work, but they're also doing incredibly great investigative work. You know, Scott talked about some of the technologies that's out there. We like the combination, the partnership of technology and good old-fashioned reporting, because as a result of that, we can spot early on these disinformation campaigns. Tools exist to help us spot them, but then the journalists have to go out and do their jobs. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. Our Ukrainian journalists are among the best investigative journalists I've ever worked with, and I'm proud of them today and every day.
Thank you. Thank you. Shota, I want to put you on the spot here now and ask you about some of the operations that you described in your opening remarks. Are those operations working? And if you could look at it from the perspective of what Steve just talked about, which is unbiased, factual, true, just, comprehensive reporting that we all expect to see from journalists. Where do you think Georgia stands from that perspective? And if you would include the investigative journalism in Georgia and how it can help with disinformation, that would be great as well.
Right. So first of all, if it's working or not, we can judge by a simple criteria. 10 years ago in this country, mentioning that somebody is a pro-Russian political actor or a civil society or a stakeholder or an individual just having pro-Russian sentiments, it was a absolutely outrageous political suicide and unbelievable thing to confess in public, you know. Now we see that we have a government in place which is the direct extension of the Russian regime, and it aligns its narratives completely and fully with those of Kremlin. So whatever mainstream anti-Western and pro-Russian narratives are prepared for this part of the world in the offices in Kremlin and other special services, we hear it out loud from the political leadership of this country. This is basically a tragedy for Georgia, but it also speaks a lot to how effectively we all together, internal and external stakeholders, were able to deal with and cope with and counter those hybrid warfare patterns that we were looking at in the broad daylight, you know, and we were reading the reports, we were reading the articles, we were aware of what Russia was doing here, but Russia was always managing somehow to extend influences not only in Georgia, but in the wider region too. But of course, this achievement of Russia is not complete, because we do have a very vibrant civil society here in this country, and the public opinion still somehow maintains very, very high support towards the Western policy. But you see, the effectiveness of propaganda can be measured even in that the people strongly support this, but because the whole information ecosystem is so polarized and the water is so muddy that it's impossible to basically stand for something very firmly, because people are confused. Some of them still believe that there might be a chance, you know, of Western integration no matter what. We're moving forward somehow. Some people see that at this point in time it is irrelevant anymore to speak about Western integration because we're moving the other way, but they don't know what to do. They can go out in the streets, they can protest for a day, two, for a week, but then, you know, it has to be structured in a better way to influence the policy. But the policy is influenced by another stakeholder and the actor. So this, from the societal resilience part, I would say we're very strong. We can even be a very good example of how this society is coping with this massive information warfare from the foreign and their own governments, you know, combined and reinforcing one another's efforts and messages. But on the other hand, how we were able to influence the policy so far is very marginal. And we have seen this country, the most pro-Western country, once again, you know, in the world, I would say, has turned into a stakeholder which has a special strategic partnership agreement with China on one hand. The leadership of this country is going to Tehran on regular basis to attend some sort of, you know, activities there. And we see this alignment on the micro level already, you know, in policy and narrative with the Russian Federation. So I would say there is a lot to learn for us how to make this knowledge that we have operational and how to put it into effective effect and how to bring to the wider public here this understanding that, okay, we all know that West is a friend, Russia is an enemy, and so what do we do about it now?
Let me turn to you now, Gustaf. So we need to learn from what we're seeing and adjust to it, you know, use technology to some extent to counter some of the malign processes by authoritarians. From the European perspective, how do you see that possible? Whose responsibility is? And Scott said that it's not the government, it's not the big tech, it's really the individuals. But is that possible to have from the individual level to resist something as organized as, you know, state-sponsored disinformation, for example? And what's the European perspective on this? And what do you see from your vantage point?
I think it was Aristotle who said, I've studied 2 weeks of philosophy at university. Aristotle said that everybody's responsibility is no one's responsibility. And the problem is that this is everybody's responsibility. It is the government's responsibility, but it's also the individual responsibility. I'm a member of parliament from Gothenburg. You're all invited there if you want to come and visit. I went to school for a study visit in a school in my constituency, and I met 12-year-olds talking about the importance of denazifying Ukraine because they've seen this on TikTok. And it's not the platform. Yeah. It could be the platform. It is the platform in some senses. But it's also that they are now getting their information without any filter from parents, without any discussion in school about being very aware of the sources. And they really believe this. And I know that the Swedish public broadcaster, SVT, they refuse for security reasons to use TikTok. But they have one exception, and that is they have a TikTok account aimed at kids from the age of 8 to 12, because they know that that's the only way they can reach them. And I think this is true. I don't like it, but I think this is true. So of course, it's everybody's responsibility, but especially also from also the government side. On the other hand, also, I think that what was brought up by Steve is that in this new way of dealing with technology also, it's not that only that we have more consumers of media and news and information, but also, and this is no news for anybody, everybody with a phone is a journalist. And what we see now in Belarus, that is that they are jailing people not for being journalists or for writing or for posting, but just for liking things on social media. People are being jailed right now. There was a guy in Arkhangelsk in Russia who was jailed because he was caught watching an anti-Putin video on his bus to school. So that is also something new which we really need to talk about. I have made a promise to some friends I talked with during lunch earlier that I will speak more about Georgia, Belarus, and Ukraine than I speak of Sweden the coming months, because that is the most important thing we can do right now, to keep it on the agenda, to talk about it, so the people get mad about it, how much we talk about keeping the situation, what we see now in this particular country, when it comes to the risks of demise into something else in October, but to keep this very high. From a European Union perspective, and I'm not an expert, despite my very young looks, I'm a very old man on the inside, so I'm not really sure about the discussion about legislation to regulate AI. I mean, that is something that has been discussed in all countries for years. But that is one thing that is making me sick and tired. The discussion about the discussion it's like the discussion about fatigue in Ukraine. There's no fatigue in support Ukraine. There's a fatigue in the discussion about fatigue, because we have these very abstract philosophical discussions that really leads nowhere forward. So I think that we really need to make a decision from a European Union perspective. What do we want to do? Not talk about what we would like to do, but what do we really want to, and get on working with it. We have a momentum now with the new Commission coming in, with the new European Parliament just being elected, and with an autumn ahead of us, which of course will be extremely focused on these things, with elections in Moldova, in this country, in the US, and so forth. So now is the momentum. It's just about getting the work done.
I wonder what Scott is thinking right now. Regulating big tech is a big issue in the U.S.
Look,
I think the EU is a bit ahead of the United States at the moment, and Google is
obviously
part of
a global company, and so the regulations that the EU has presented, like going back to GDPR, have been honestly very welcome, because if there's so many countries out there who all have a different perspective, and the EU has taken leadership in that space, and they've become an innovator in that space. And so you see many US states adopting GDPR, et cetera. But what I was going to say is that this is a whole society thing. And it's not as if the tech companies want to be on the wrong side of history. I mean, they want to collaborate with democracies on strengthening democracies. But to the point about the ways in which we are socialized today and the ways that I was socialized, like completely different. And so we're still grappling with the enormous change that has taken place. But we have to do that as a society. One of the things that I also wanted to stress here is that we are open societies. And more ideas are better. Being able to share your views, being able to get them out there. But in a place like Russia right now, they recognize that a platform like YouTube is ultimately a major threat to them, because that's the way much of the information about what's actually happening is getting into the country, and they don't like it. And they want to not only shut YouTube down, but they want to make it impossible for the open internet to connect to Russia. Not in the same way China has done. They want to do it differently, which will actually be more problematic for we as democracies around the world, because that technology might be exportable. Mm-hmm. So I think our team is like working really hard to understand that problem, to understand what they're trying to do, feeding that into Google. But again, it's something that all of us need to be deeply concerned about.
I would like to open the questions part, but before I do that, just please hold those thoughts. One final question from me to you, Steve. We talked about big tech, talked about TikTok was brought up, YouTube, of course. As a media organization, not only you, but everybody in the media is largely dependent on the social networks. So do you, from your perspective, do you see any danger that in some cases Russia can block content, or it's already blocked, I presume, in Russia, but other countries that are semi-autocracies, therefore limiting your ability to access and provide people with information in those countries?
I think we have a responsibility to be everywhere where the audience is. If somebody wants If somebody's looking at TikTok, we're going to be there. If somebody wants a feature-length documentary on really great investigative work, we need to do that as well. Interesting, one of the biggest initiatives we've got going right now is designed to reach inside of Iran. And the way we're doing it is not with the formal, good evening, here now the news from Radio Free Europe. That will not work these days. And so what we're doing are podcasts, 21 different podcasts a week, doing things like taking a look at women's rights issues inside Iran. And when that programming is very powerful, when it comes from somebody who looks like members of our audience, who speaks the same language, those types of things, programs that look at music, it can be a gateway programming into any number of different topics. We need to create and reinforce our relevance, and using every means possible. Yeah, we'll use YouTube, we'll use Telegram, we'll use all of it, because if that's where the audience is, then we need to meet them there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And wow, lots of hands. Let's take first 3 questions from the front rows. Georgi, Nino, and yes, please.
Georgi Baramidze, I'm political secretary of the UNM, Mikhail Saakashvili's party. We all know now that what we've been saying all these years, that Ivanishvili and his team serving Putin's interests is true. And Putin and Russia using Georgia quite a long time already as a kind of laboratory for all kind of nasty methods, disinformation, slander, and so on and so forth. And we know that now...
Georgi, please, we have a lot of hands up. Please ask your question if you would, please.
Yeah, I need to approach what I want to ask you. And now we are in the very important moment when Georgians should decide whether we go toward west or to the Russian swamp. So and we know how this disinformation works and how powerful Russian Kremlin propaganda is working, which is kind of extension of it, that this government is very effectively using it. What West, what European Union, what United States and our friends can do in order to help Georgian society to defeat this big lie and disinformation, having in mind that our NGOs that are fighting this disinformation now being practically abolished. Thank you.
Thank you. Nino, please, please everybody be brief with the
Nino
questions.
Japaridze. Scott, the question is for you. Yes, GDPR is brilliant, but in the US we've also led important initiatives. One of them, this May, 3 legislative acts were passed bipartisan support in the Senate, led by Amy Klobuchar, and they're all focused on the US use of AI to defend democracy in the US and globally. As the representative of the technology community, how responsive do you think these acts are to actual threats that technology companies face? And the second question is, really quickly, diaspora. With Georgia's elections, we're talking about Georgia's elections and disinformation. There is too much focus on disinformation only inside of Georgia, not sufficient focus on disinformation of the diaspora, and that's where the AI-based solutions and players like you have a role to play. Are you planning to aid Georgia?
Okay.
Thank you.
And please, on the side.
Hi, this is Galushko with OSF. I'm wondering what lessons we should be drawing from the arrest of Pavel Durov and the Telegram situation in general in terms of content moderation, AI, disinformation, and how it all flew under the radar for so long. Thank you.
Scott, it sounds like you have more questions than anybody else.
Was that your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not the public policy leader at Google. I try to keep up with what all is going on the policy front. What I would say is I don't know the details of the legislation that was passed, But in terms of the spirit of it, it's the right way to go. And I think that the challenge is in the implementation, especially as the technology continues to change and evolve. So there are lots of various efforts out there to have people feed their algorithms that they're using for Gen AI into a common database, which then can be used to test for deepfakes. But it won't ever capture all the ways in which AI is being used by different people in different contexts. So again, I think that the spirit is right. I think we can make some real progress there. But again, it's hardening the public to the fact that these things are going to be out there, and to be aware and to be concerned and to take a deep breath before you do anything with the information you get, especially if it's in a very problematic context. But I do think that I don't know how responsive the legislation and its proposed solutions are to the actual threat. And I would love to, I'll dig into that more. On Pavel Durov's arrest, I think it was shocking. It was something where I still am unclear as to what the goal of the arrest is. I don't have any I don't think we've had time to digest what it will mean for issues related to content moderation, if the implication is that when a government arrests somebody, they'll hold them until you do what it is that you want them, those governments want to do. So I think that there's a lot of confusion around what happened, why it happened, still being disseminated, still being analyzed. But I'm really, really interested in that whole set of conversations and the implications of it, because it's going to have a dramatic impact and chilling effect, I think, in maybe the wrong ways. And it's going to encourage, again, what you do in a democracy then becomes something that the autocrats can do with impunity because you've done it.
I think there's a danger here that, Telegram, let's just simply shut down Telegram because it has been used in some cases for people to do harm. But there's an awful lot of people who share information that journalists take a look at. We do our own reporting as a result of that. In some cases, we're distributing our programming through Telegram channels. Right. It depends on the region, but I think, as Scott was saying, I think caution is an important word right now.
But
Diaspora.
This is my first trip to Georgia. I don't know a whole lot about the diaspora in the US and Europe and elsewhere, so I don't know. But what I do know is that diaspora communities in general are target-rich environments for disinformation from those who want to convey it, by governments, by China, by others, that they're especially in countries in which those communities are kind of on the margins of society. So as you would expect, where there's grievance, disinformation can help aggravate that grievance, and has been very effective, going back to my initial point about ISIS. That's who they targeted. They targeted diaspora communities that were not well integrated, and tried to convince them that the societies that they were living in, that gave them shelter and freedom, were now the enemies.
But this is why this is exactly where we pick up, because our programming, which is in Georgian or in any number of 27 different languages, is designed to be not only consumed inside the country, but also by the diaspora. We do not target, just so I'm clear, we do not target the United States. That's not that's not our focal point. But it is, yes, it is a place of, it can foster disinformation in those areas, but I also believe that the flip side is true, that important, vital, factual information can be shared with these communities as well, in the native tongue.
And Gustaf, I'm going to give you the easy one now. Like, what can the West do to help Georgia?
To help Georgia. Well, that is the question of the hour. I think I was in Chisinau last week, and I listened to President Sandu, and she said that, because as you know, they have elections as well a week ahead of Georgia, and she said that the more misinformation and the more propaganda from Russia, the better, because people are now in Moldova stopping to believe it, because it's so extreme what they see and what they pump into the country. She said it with some humor, but I thought it was rather interesting, because there's no limit of the stupidity of the propaganda right now in Moldova, which is rather interesting. There's a lot of things we can do, I think, and I don't really see this as a possible reality, but we need to prepare ourselves for it. And that is what will happen if the opposition wins the election, if Ivanishvili doesn't accept the outcome of the election, and we will see, of course, protests on the streets, as we saw in May and June, and then we will go into a situation which we had in Minsk in August and September of 2020. Mm-hmm. Slowly, slowly, slowly. So that's why it is so extremely important, and that is also the cheapest way and the easiest way of supporting Georgia and the democratic forces in Georgia, is to talk. And to make sure that this is high on the agenda when the Foreign Affairs Council is meeting in Brussels, to keep it high on the agenda of Swedish politicians, to really emphasize that what is happening now is not only important for Georgia, it's also important for Europe, which Georgia belongs to and is a part of. That can't be said more than enough. And also that this is really to say this or nothing. I mean, this is really it for Georgia, this coming election, and to really keep on talking about it. Mm-hmm. And that is also one thing that politicians tend to be rather good at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And very quickly, to emphasize that point, international election observers.
Yes.
International election observers, to have as many here as possible during those elections. I hope to be one of them.
Good. Shota, do you have a comment?
That's what exactly I wanted to emphasize here. The elections are around the corner, and we have an experience with previous elections when very well-intended observer missions were equipped with 20th century tools to try to counter the 21st century digital authoritarianism. And I think that's a bigger problem. It's a bigger problem than only Georgia, you know, and this election manipulation is happening in an absolutely different way now than it used to happen before the internet time. And these missions, most of those missions are not prepared to identify, document, and react to those manipulation patterns that are enabled now through the new information environment and through the cyberspace, in and through the cyberspace. So we know for absolute certainty that there's 300,000 civil servants that work in the budgetary institutions in this country, what we call it, you know, administrative resource. They are one way or another harassed to go and vote for the ruling party. And we have seen this in the reports, including in the OSCE report, which was quoted by the United States Embassy in Tbilisi, that what we saw in the previous parliamentary elections was blurring the boundaries between the ruling party and the state. And then, all in all, the observer report was saying that yes, there were shortcomings, there were problems, but you know, these elections were not perfect, but we somehow still legitimized the elections with a lot of problems. And here I come to the core of this problem, because there were thousands of evidence collected by the investigative journalists, which you mentioned before. There were thousands of evidence collected by the local civil society organizations. And because they were disregarded and dismissed altogether by the Central Election Committee, which is again the extension of the ruling party, or the courts, which is again the extension of the ruling party, you know, We ended up with the situation when it was quacking like a duck, it looked like a duck, but actually we were still looking for some more evidence, to say that, yeah, basically it was a duck. So in this particular situation, I think that in general, the main problem of contemporary information environment is to find the blurred boundaries between the truth and the false. And what we know for sure, we have to be able to stand for it.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the West can help.
Right.
I saw more hands in the back. So we have 2 minutes, literally, before we need to stop. So let's take quick 3 questions in the front, in the back, and on the side here, Georgi. Oh, you have the mic. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to thank Shota for mentioning Georgia as an example of the success of Russian hybrid warfare. And to add a little bit of salt on that, the Georgian government's Strategic Communications Department, an institution established with Western money to counter Russian disinformation. A last year report by Meta, the Facebook parent company, said that institution coordinates dissemination of Russian disinformation. So Western taxpayer money funded Russian disinformation in Georgia, and some of this cooperation continued even after publication of Meta investigation.
Thank you, Georgi. We had a question up front here.
Yeah,
sorry.
Nate Ostler from Kiev Independent. I wanted to ask about you mentioned that children were hearing about this Ukrainian Nazis narrative. How do you go about addressing this without amplifying we find this problem all the time at work. We have this issue, we want to debunk it, but we also don't want to keep talking about it so that then it reaches more people. How do you kind of square this circle?
That's a steep question, I guess. Please.
And it's an age-old problem, and you're 100% right to keep it in mind while trying to do it. I think it's very difficult, though, to say, the extreme would be to say, well, just ignore it because we know it's not true. But then how do you, if you agree that that's dangerous, then how do you do it without recommitting the foul? And you can perhaps talk about the long, proud heritage, inclusive heritage inside Ukraine and things like that. But there is no simple answer on how to handle that without compounding the original problem.
Mm-hmm. Quickly.
Hello, Anita Ntsade, non-resident fellow of the German Marshall Fund. First of all, thank you for being with us, and thank you, moderator, for encouraging this discussion, which is very important personally for me because I'm doing my research about Russian information warfare in the occupied territories of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And this is very important, just briefly I will mention that if we want to talk, very important question. While the disinformation can be in the domestic originated, but also state influence, it is obvious in the research that our defense measure was not enough efficient to mitigate the disinformation. And do you think it is the time to implement more offensive measures?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that summarizes, I had a closing question in mind, and I think it's going to dovetail with that very nicely. Basically, who's winning and what do we need to do to win? So let's start from you, Scott.
I think that my money is on democracies and Democrats who are able to move fast, think clearly, have resilience in their societies. That's where I am most confident. I know that authoritarians have a lot of influence within our societies, but I do believe that a free press, complemented with robust education for the population, with the collaboration of big tech companies that are aligned fundamentally with democracies, that we're going to win.
Mm-hmm. Shota, let's come to you.
Well, basically, we're in front of this really decisive battle. Maybe we have said this earlier too much, but now it's really about, the actual orientation of this country. On one side, we have Belarusia, which is a fait accompli, and it's a point of non-return after this election. So there will be no way of leveraging, this government into changing the policies anytime soon. And on the other hand, we have this very difficult situation with the state capture that was mentioned from the stage many times, and very complex and muddied information environment where it's impossible for the people to judge clearly, even in this, given this very hard evidence that we have in front of us. So this battle is not only about Georgia. It is connected with Ukraine. It is connected with the bigger geopolitical environment. So I really do hope that the observer missions will be ready for the monitoring of these elections, and then the things that will happen during and after these elections will basically make sure that the choice of the Georgian people will be duly reflected in the final outcomes of this decisive election.
Gustaf.
I wanted to answer the question to me about the young people on social media. I mean, when I was at that school and I heard that these kids were talking about the importance of the denazification of Ukraine, of course, the first thing I had to do was to cancel all the meetings for the rest of the day and to have an offline discussion with them. Because I don't think that the Russian propaganda which is working, which is aimed at Sweden, nobody in Sweden believes it, because it has this old Brezhnev narrative that no one in Sweden really cares about. They're good in hybrid operations. They're good in, I mentioned the burning of the Holy Quran, for example, but in the pure propaganda is aimed at those who just don't have any filters to it, which are the young. And I think that you shouldn't reproduce the narrative online. You should have an offline discussion with them. And it will take time, and you will get mad, but that is the only way you can deal with this in a Swedish perspective.
Well, thank you very much. And since I'm partial to RFE, you have the closing word, and please
Thank you so
proceed.
much. Thank you for the moderation today, and thanks for all the questions. Very quickly, your question was who's winning? The game's not over. A gathering like this, in future times, if things don't go the right way, this will be an illegal gathering. Yes. And we can't allow Georgia, a wonderful place that has treasured its freedoms for so long, to fall into that situation. It has happened elsewhere, but the reason I remain optimistic is I believe it is impossible to simply silence every voice of opposition, every dissenting viewpoint, every member of the free press, and also at the core of it is people who long to be free, and those cherished freedoms are not going to be taken away lightly. There's a huge opportunity here in this country on October 26th to help determine which way this goes. And I think there's a lot of hard work that's going to have to be done between now and then, and we'll be on the absolutely watching with great interest.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Please thank the panelists for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much, panel. Ia, thank you for a great job.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you also to this panel for not passing out. We have two panels left, so we're going to transition quickly to the next one, so stay tuned. Thank you very much. right, come on back. We're about to get started. Ambassador Hofstrom, have a seat. Okay, we are going to resume with our penultimate panel. How's that for alliteration? Democracy versus authoritarianism flows very nicely from the previous panel. And leading us in moderating is Vlad Galushko from Open Society Foundations, a supporter of this conference as well. Vlad, we're grateful for that and grateful for your moderation. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, David. I'm really excited to start this panel. We got Anna Fotyga, former member of the European Parliament, Miranda Patrucic with Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. We have Fredrik Löjdquist with Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, and we have Alex Sokolowski with the U.S. Agency for International Development. So I want to kick our discussion off by asking this question to Anna. I think since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion to Ukraine, we've just been stunned really by an enormous level of alignment, both formal and informal, among authoritarian powers. So how do you assess this alignment between different autocracies, and how do you think democracies are responding to it, including the European Union?
Well, first statement is positive. Consolidation of autocracies in view of full-scale Russian invasion, war of aggression on Ukraine, waged since February 24th, 2022. It's a positive sign, meaning that they have to react also to what we, the collective West, do in terms of supporting Ukraine. But that is the end of a positive message towards this, although it is unprecedented solidarity that we are able to show within collective West is far from enough to really defeat the aggressor. And from my point of view, any solution other than major fundamental defeat of Russia in aggression of Ukraine means lack of credibility of the collective West as well, because our force, whatever we discuss here during variety of panels, is prevailing. And here I have to go back slightly. After the Cold War, many of Western leaders used to think that autocracies are actually vicious criminal regimes like Kremlin, where it was possible to modernize them by engagement. And it was actually either lack of knowledge or naivety in this kind of assessment. Same actually applies nowadays to PRC, to China as well. Sometimes I think that similar mistakes that were taken in terms of our approach towards Russia have been repeated in dealing with China. By the way, China is not the lover of stability only. Remember, and nobody mentioned here, the civil-military fusion going on there. So be aware about this. Also concepts of the West, earlier concepts of eventuality of strategic sequencing. So we can engage with Russia and try to pacify it, usually over the heads of countries and nations of my region, Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Caucasus as well, or predominantly Southern Caucasus. Georgia is a study case here in this respect, with so many mistakes made, and we still need consistency in our approach. Although I think that, as many of you here, that it is turning point for Georgian society, but it is not about talking. It is about action. And the major action is the voting card in your hands. I'm not academia person. I survived during opposing communist rule in Poland. My earliest engagement was Polish Solidarność, Foreign Affairs Department of this, under communist rule, not after changes. And I would encourage Georgians, young Georgians, to try to remain in the country, because I'm absolutely sure that our help, our assistance is needed. But everything that is meaningful has to come from here, from inside. Of course, we have to assist. And time is extremely difficult because of things mentioned by Georgi Kandelaki, many issues. The necessity to de-Stalinize the country, mistakes in financing and misuse of our funds. By the way, not only here. For example, we continue within the EU to finance heavily variety of projects in Cuba linked to the Raúl Castro regime, millions of euros. We have to return to real consistency, and when we build resilience within the collective West, we have to know that there are variety of ideas within the collective West that also have temptation to use these muddy waters to gain prevailing position. We have to return to solidarity ideas, and that is important. Action, action, action. And if anything happens, not harsh diplomatic notes. I've seen them so many times. We have tools on our disposal. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Maybe staying on one of the points that you raised about engaging with autocracies. I was listening the other weekend to an excellent podcast where Victoria Nuland spoke with Mikhail Ziger. And she said, you know, in the early thousands, there was a theory that, you know, we just engage with Russia and let whatever happens inside the box stay inside that box. Now, I'm wondering if there is, and that's my question to Fredrik, if there is a connection between internal repression, internal huge and gross human rights violation, and then external aggression.
Thank you. No, indeed there is. I mean, the short answer to your question is, of course, there is. And I mean, democracy, and I include, when I speak about democracy, I also include sort of human rights and rule of law. This is a package that comes together. Are of course important in themselves and for the individuals and for the citizens, but they're also very important in terms of international security and international relations. And as you said, that there is a direct link between internal repression and external aggression. And this is, Ambassador Beer and I, we worked at this very much when we were ambassador at the OSCE, and we were actually even labeled, as Dan reminded me, of the Taliban's of human rights, and I wear that as a badge of honor. But that's what in OSCE terms is called the comprehensive concepts of security, and I think that is a very important one. And coming to Russia, I mean, the Russian regime, Kremlin, obviously sees democracy as an existential threat, not only inside of Russia, and that's hence we have all the repression in Russia. And we have long talked about Russia as an increasingly authoritarian country, but you can only be increasingly for so long. So I think we were looking basically at the neo-totalitarian system right now. But they also see democracy in itself and democracy in other countries as an existential threat. And that's why I think that's why they had to start the war against Ukraine in 2014. This had absolutely nothing to do about NATO. It had to do with the will of the Ukrainian people to get closer to Europe and to develop into sort of democratic European state. And therefore, they started a military aggression already in 2014 in order to gain full control over Ukraine. And then they tried various means. And when they had exhausted that turned into a full-scale invasion in 2022. So Russia, it's a double problem because authoritarian states or dictatorships or totalitarian states are inherently unsecure for other countries because authoritarian states are much more likely to make these kind of decisions, for external aggression. But it's also a direct attack on the principle of democracy and the rules-based order and the European security order. So it's a double threat. And I think we're mistaken if we believe that Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, the war in itself, is as bad as it is. It's the main problem. That's the only problem. No, it's only a symptom of the problem. It's a manifestation of that problem. So we shouldn't be fooled to believe that if only we have, some kind of ceasefire or stop or some kind of Minsk III agreement, the problem will go away. No. I mean, the Russian attack is much, much wider than only against Ukraine. It's an attack on our democracies, and we see, as in the previous panels and other panels, how they also use various kinds of hybrid threats, hybrid means to undermine our democracies. So we have to remember that this is a systemic threat which goes much, much further beyond Ukraine. And of course, in Georgia, I mean, Russia has very long and partially successfully tried to undermine, democracy in Georgia, and that's why the upcoming elections are so important. And in that sense, that's my final point. That's why also it's so important to hold Russia accountable for its violation, human rights violation, and violations of democracy inside of Russia. And the OSCE is one place where you can do that. But also all the terrible human rights violations that they have, committed in Ukraine and elsewhere. Because only through this accountability we can sort of uphold these underlying principles. And the last, warning, because when we tend to get to military war and military conflicts, we tend to focus very much on that logic, and that's where all the sort of the realists of this world, sort of in the academic sense, come out. And the realists tend to sort of disregard the importance of the nature of the political system and political regime. These are the Mersheimers and Sam Sharaps and all the people who write in foreign affairs all the time. But I think, and then that is fatal flaw and misunderstanding if we disregard, democracy and upholding democracy also in terms to safeguard, security between states, international security, and the international rules-based order.
Thanks, Fredrik. To build on your point about hybrid threats, I think someone said secrecy and democracy are always at odds with each other, right? And kleptocracy is one of the major tools that authoritarian regimes have used both to thrive and to undermine democracies. Miranda, your organization has done so much work highlighting these kleptocratic connections, including in this country. And I think it would be extremely interesting for our audience to know about that.
Thank you for having me here. I've been editor-in-chief for a year, which means that going beyond the local region, I've been seeing the stories we have done worldwide. And I almost feel like every time we do a story about autocratic regime, it's a copycat of another story that we have seen, develop in Russia, we have seen developed in Serbia, we've seen develop in Azerbaijan. It's almost like these people are copying each other's and basically learning the new tricks and new way. A fascinating story for me on how the regime turns autocratic actually is the one, we have published a couple of weeks ago a story about a Georgian oligarch who happens to have, his wife happens to have a couple of properties in Russia. And to be honest, as, editor-in-chief, I was thinking, okay, he's a rich guy, she's rich, is this really a story? And everybody kept telling us, okay, it's, Russia, it's important. So we ended up publishing saying, okay, everybody was wondering what's happening in Russia, here's your answer. But what I was surprised by and really fascinated was the kind of reaction we got, because I've never seen that in Georgia. I've seen, it almost appeared that within the minutes of publishing, the government became a beehive. And there were all these bees bringing gifts and basically giving public statements how, and lying to the public here saying what we published was a lie. You had no way to check what we published and whether it's true or not. And I've seen this, I've seen this in Russia, I've seen this in Serbia, I've seen this, in all these places where I report, I've seen it in Kyrgyzstan, which, recently went from most democratic country in Central Asia to probably one of the worst. And then we've seen the use of media, because really once you capture the media, you basically start controlling the narrative. And actually it's been 4 weeks and we are still getting, last night there was a story that aired, basically, this time they did admit, it seems, our findings, so they agreed that what we reported was true, but we are still there to destabilize and destroy and I don't know what else. And of course I'm a CIA agent, or CCRP is, and we are publishing what CIA tells us. It is really crazy, but again, it's the same playbook we see in other authoritarian countries, which is you want to turn media into enemies. You want to turn independent media into a fear factor and somebody to be afraid of because they're attacking your country and they're attacking everything you hold dear. There was an interesting story that I read in New York Times a couple of days ago, which was about Nicaragua and the ruler of Nicaragua, who basically has sold the story to his people as he's preventing crime by basically jailing anybody. And again, what we see as a pattern is that the world leaders in Latin America are actually coming to Nicaragua to get his recipe of success. Because it has turned very successful. Because yes, the streets are safer, but a lot of opposition figures, a lot of media actors, they're all in jail as well as those criminals. And in the darkness where you don't have free press to report about what's going on really, people are not aware of everything else that has become a victim of this kind of system. And so my final thoughts is, in Georgia, it is a turning point. Because, as we've seen in Russia, as we've seen in Kyrgyzstan, foreign agent law is the first step to basically remove any independent actor and force them into exile. The countries like this, once you take that step, it just goes into the darkness, and hopefully it's not going to be the case with Georgia.
Thanks, Miranda. Staying on Georgia, Alex, US aid has been engaged in the country since Georgia's independence. So I'm sure the words you're hearing these days come as a huge surprise to you. So when you think about it, what steps should Georgia be taking to start moving in a more positive direction, and how does US aid fit into this picture?
Sure, great. Thank you very much for that. It's great to be here today. I've been coming to Georgia for 20 years, so it's really great to always, every time I come back. It is clear that Georgia is facing a deeply challenging moment for its democracy right now, based on the recent passage of the foreign influence law and a number of other indications of democratic backsliding. But I know that in our first session yesterday, our first session today, and in the last session, we've had a lot of conversation about that already, so I don't want to reiterate that here now. So instead, despite those challenges, and maybe even because of them, I'd like to offer some thoughts about what we could do to move Georgia's democracy in a more constructive direction. But before I do that, actually, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit, just briefly, and list a number of factors of strength that Georgia still has with regard to its democracy that sometimes we can lose sight of, and I think those are really important. And this is drawing on experience from the region and also drawing on the scholarship of democratization. So first, I would say that democratic values run deep in Georgia. Survey after survey for decades in Georgia has shown strong support of the public for the key elements of democracy. And that's a really important thing, especially when we see strain on institutions. Secondly, Georgians see themselves as part of Europe, and Europe is opening the door to Georgia. Now, again, there are recent challenges and so forth, but the fact that Georgia has candidate status is really important. The conversation is about that. So I'd rather have that. Third, Georgia has developed significantly from a socioeconomic perspective over the last 20 years. I can tell you the country I came to 21 years ago was very different than the one you see today in terms of the development of its economy. And as we know from Seymour Martin Lipset, that makes a difference in terms of the prospects for democracy. Fourth, Georgia now has substantial experience in building democratic institutions and processes over that 2-decade period. And that makes a difference, right? They have excelled in some of these areas, so it's been done before, it can continue. Fifth, and related to this most importantly, Georgia has run a series of elections that were considered by international groups to be largely free and fair. That's important. It's also executed 2 peaceful transfers of power. That's important if you look at what, Huntington's 2 turnover test. So these are things in Georgia's history important. And then sixth and finally, as we've seen over the last year especially, there's a new younger generation of Georgians who seem committed to democracy. So having taken all those things into account, now we have a little bit more confidence that maybe Georgia can do well. I want to quickly go into what Georgia can and should do in the near term, especially given the fact that this is a polarized, contested, and high-stakes moment. And I'll also note what USAID is doing to support those things. So first and most important is a well-run, peaceful, transparent, free, and fair election. More so than usual, a credible electoral process will be crucial not only for keeping EU hopes and aspirations alive, but for democracy more broadly. And USAID is supporting robust domestic and international oversight of the elections through long and short-term monitoring missions. USAID is also providing technical assistance to the Central Election Commission, both to help train poll workers, as we often do, but to train them on the new electronic voting system that they're rolling out for these elections. Second, I think we need to see a high level of civic participation in these elections. High voter turnout is also really important for instilling public confidence in the process. And USAID is supporting broad-based efforts to get out the vote and voter education initiatives. Third, and this is a bit prospectively, a new parliament and new mandates from voters may create the possibility for a new dialogue between the government and civil society. Now, I recognize that a real good faith effort towards that dialogue may seem remote and may not turn out to be feasible, but I would argue that a credible election process makes that more likely, and that ultimately we have to come to that dialogue at some point. And USAID would be glad to support, as it has in the past over many years, those kinds of dialogues between state and society. So finally, I'll just end with the fact that Georgia can still regain its footing on the path towards consolidated democracy and towards Europe. It has made so much progress in this area, and this is still within reach. That can happen one step at a time, and that first key step is going to be these elections in late October. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Before we move a little bit away from Georgia, let's also zoom on the region, because we have another country right next to it, Armenia, where a geopolitical pivot is happening. And that pivot is not happening in geographic vacuum. And that is important, I think, to keep in mind. So how do you see the repercussion of the Georgian election beyond Georgia and on the region in general?
If I could start, and I've made this comment, so Georgia is so important for the Caucasus beyond Georgia itself. As many of you know, Armenia, that you mentioned, is a landlocked country. And it is going to rely on Georgia for things like access to the Middle Corridor, trade, building its energy security, and all these different things. But it's also, I think, psychological. You know, there have been a lot of calls for some other powers to engage in this 3+3, which I think we in the United States and Europe should not welcome and do not welcome. And Georgia in the past has been the one always saying, no, we will not do that. If Georgia says yes, then Armenia looks very isolated and very challenged. So yes, Georgia is not important only for its own sake, but it is, you know, it's an overused term, but it really is a linchpin state in the Caucasus from my perspective.
Anna, over to you.
Yeah. I used to observe almost all elections in contemporary Georgia, surely every election since 2011. And I must say that regardless to reports, when you go deep and you know well society and circumstances, you have your very crucial concerns. First, about pre-election time and equal possibilities for all actors, or political actors, parties, to act and to present their views to voters. Secondly, it is to a large extent still although very much changing, but still having some kind of clan organization as well. So ways of exerting influence are sometimes not readable to external observers. So that is difficult. But yes, the civil society here is vibrant. They have tools to observe elections properly. That is why also for us it is so important to have links with them and to support them. When you ask about Armenia, I think that it was civil society actually, extremely vibrant civil society that was able to carry Armenia farther and to this point, despite extremely inconvenient, I would say, circumstances with Russian bases, with a lot of Russian influence there. Yes, elections in Georgia have a lot to say to Armenian people, but I think that their determination is also their own will to put their own country on proper path. Armenia is long-standing, unbelievable culture, and I'm confident their future is because of their attitude. But as I say, whole region, if not whole world, depends on the outcome of war waged on Ukraine. We cannot allow, not only, well, we speak about supporting Ukraine whatever it takes, or until Ukraine prevails. Oh, imagine Hitler being defeated, just being pushed out of Poland or Lithuania without major fundamental defeat. This kind of regime would not stop.
Thanks, Anna. Maybe I'll go back to Fredrik since we're on the Russia subject. Your recent paper said we need to contain, constrain, and counter the imminent Russian danger. We had an article in Politico, I think a couple of weeks ago, where it said that there is reluctance to give Ukraine an opportunity to use military aid as it sees fit because there is a fear that then we won't be able to re-engage with Russia after the war. And, you know, some of that statement was walked back, but Ukrainians and a lot of Eastern Europeans were still left with a sense of confusion, you know, whether there is a strategy or we're still muddling through and looking for the next best option. So how would you look at that?
Well, yeah, no, I think this is a crucial question, and I think the big problem we have now is the sort of a lack of a clear vision what the West really wants to achieve in Ukraine, and also a long-term strategy towards Russia, because the Russia problem is much wider than Ukraine, and it won't go away. I mean, a necessary but far from sufficient precondition, anything changing for the better with Russia is, of course, a change of the political system and the political regime. And I think we're still in the West we have not really understood the full implication. You know, we haven't done really the mental Zeitenwende and understood fully what's at stake and what the sort of opportunity cost and what the alternative is. And I think there are people in Washington and in Berlin and others that either they hope or they think that the Russia problem can be contained somehow to Ukraine. We can manage it, and it wouldn't spread further, either militarily or otherwise. In my point, what I'm trying to make is that that's based on a false assumption. You can't give up Ukraine and think that we will have a sort of stable equilibrium of some kind. So either the West and especially Europe, EU, manages to stabilize Europe eastwards, or we will be destabilized from. And just an additional note on the wider implications of the Georgian elections. And I think it's important because we are in a critical period, I think, the next 6-12 months for various reasons. And Russia is not doing very well. They're not doing very well in Ukraine, and I think the elections in Moldova seem to be going in the right way. But if the result of the election here would prove that sort of Russian blackmail and Russian fear-mongering, that if you try to oppose Russia or complain about Russia, you're a war party, you're provoking war. I mean, the undertone of all that argument is fairly, pretty scaring, so to say. And we will have a political system that is increasingly authoritarian and based sort of on the Russian political system and political practices. That is shown, then Russia can show that, we're actually gaining ground. And I think that would be a very unfortunate, some kind of a Russian momentum, so to say. And that will only sort of feed the arguments that we have in the West, that this is what I would call the defeatist or the fatalistic school. Russia can't be defeated, Ukraine can't win the war, or shouldn't even win the war because it's too dangerous, because, Russia would be too provoked and so forth. So therefore, I think this confrontation line we have with Russia has many fronts. The most important one is, of course, in Ukraine, but it also goes through Georgia here.
Thanks, Fredrik. I think in addressing authoritarian threats, there is an external front and there is a home front. And I want to turn to Miranda on that question. And go back to the issue of kleptocracy. Anne Applebaum recently had a really good piece where she said, we feel really happy when we seize a couple of yachts in London. And then, it's a good first step. But she's advocating for kind of an anti-kleptocracy network where governments, civil society, and media would work both together and transnationally to not only expose these threats, but counter them through accountability. As someone sitting with a media outlet that is focused on this, what is your take on that suggestion?
I actually do agree that the media, civil society, and government should act together. I think the law enforcement itself on the government side does not effectively cross borders. I think, civil society and media, if they're not working together, their impact is actually smaller. OCCRP actually has something called Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which is basically our model to, leverage the work that we produce with impact and actions by the civil society. The way we do it is because we have a wall between the journalism. Journalists are trying not to be activists and not to promote, changes and arrests and things like that, but we actually feed our information, our findings through civil society and Transparency International, and then they can take action and share our findings with the governments. I think it's crucial that, the problem we have at the moment is that even when it comes to Russia, we are sending a very mixed messaging. Russia is, Putin just recently visited Azerbaijan, had a meeting with the President Aliyev. Aliyev is, jailing so many journalists at the moment, closing down the media. We are not reacting. So we're sending a mixed messages. Okay, you as autocrat are fine. European Union will do business with you. We'll buy gas, we'll buy oil. Do what you do. And then on the other hand, we have, Russia and we have Iran, and we're like, oh, you can't do it. But then it also sends a message to, Kyrgyzstan, other places. Well, maybe we will take you, maybe we will not take you, because depends if we have a higher interest. So I think, we need to all stand on the one side and be like consistent in our messaging, and that means media, civil society, and governments. And, the world is black and white. There's no different shades of gray at this moment, because with the different shades of gray, basically we allow those who are leaning toward authoritarianism to go unpunished and basically do that.
Let me tie my last question before we open to the audience to Anna. You had a very damning verdict on Europe's energy policy. You said the result has been a naive Europe subsidizing Russian hostility while deepening our exposure to energy blackmail. How do you see us tackling this weakness without also empowering other authoritarian regimes?
I believe that Euro-Atlantic alliance means something. And here it is not Europe and the EU. Yes, that is true. I was critical of European energy policy for decades, actually in my variety of functions, including the function of the Office of Foreign Minister of Poland, and engagement in Georgia at that time as well. But I think that energy tool, as it was used very early and written in Russia's strategic documents as early as 2005, indicating that Russia wanted to use energy tools in hydrocarbons in particular as a vehicle of influence in the near neighborhood and farther beyond. Unfortunately, many powers disregarded this, were either naive or tended to pursue interests, first having cheaper, I would say, energy subsidies. What is positive, I think that surely after war on Ukraine, also Russia decided to dismantle unity of the collective West because after effect was also collapse slump on global energy market. And then we saw signs of real solidarity, also decisions in the United States. When I delivered alarming messages, for example, in National Insider, also in the US, was any sign of dismantling this unity. There is, by the way, there is also a second area that is necessary to build solidarity of the collective West in dealing with the grain crisis, because it was the action, side action by Russian Federation aimed at global society and collective West as well. Unfortunately, many countries, even allies, used or misused this situation, trying to place themselves in better position. So we have to return to very rigid solidarity in dealing with all these problems. But when we, one final sentence about Russian Federation, surely when we speak about kleptocracy, it is obvious we have to deal with this. It has been exported to many countries. Series of crises made us less vigilant to this. So all policies to build resilience of allies and member states are very proper, and I see positive process in both organizations, both in NATO and the EU, to deal with these issues. But still, it is not enough.
Thanks, Anna. Why don't we open the floor to questions? I see Georgi, James, and one person behind. So we'll start with this row, 3 questions, and then we'll expand. Georgi. I think our microphone died because of the heat.
We are lucky not to die here.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Minister Fotyga, for mentioning this issue that we fought for over the years, which is countering resurgence of the image of Stalin in this country. And I have a question to you, which concerns the European External Action Service. But first, a quick note, a quick point to Mr. Sokolowski. I've too studied democratization theory, and I'm afraid, in my opinion, Georgia has not passed Huntington's 2 times turnover rule, because power in Georgia changed through elections peacefully only once in 2012.
Yeah.
2004 was non-violent but revolution. So Georgia still has to pass that test. And the big question of the upcoming election is whether this society is capable of producing a smooth electoral change of power. And the question about the EAS is, when we say, and some of my colleagues in the civil society of which I'm part, that Georgia is on the verge of Russian victory, we know that many people think we are exaggerating. But our objective is not for this to happen and then for us to say, we told you so. Our objective is for this not to happen. And in my mind, the European External Action Service and its bureaucratization of the Georgian file in Brussels in particular has been one of the key enablers of the growth of Russian influence in Georgia. And Minister Fotyga, perhaps you could recall the dynamic European Parliament at large had with the EAS over its differences, how to deal with Georgia's backsliding and the growth of Russian influence. That would be, I'm sure, interesting. Thank you.
James, and then a participant behind you.
Thanks, Vlad. James Nixie, Chatham House. It seems to me that the most attractive thing that autocracies can offer other autocracies, or autocrats, is a guarantee of regime security, a carte blanche, if you like. So my question is, very simply, how can we possibly top such an attractive offer?
Thanks, James. And behind
Giga Bokharia, thank you. Well, Georgi addressed one of the questions I had. I was going to ask Alexander, when was the second one? We kind of missed the second orderly transfer of power in Georgia. I guess you meant Rose Revolution, which was still a revolution. Yeah? As a citizen of this country, I'm enormously grateful to American people and our Western partners for all the assistance, and USAID in particular. And Alexander, your personal role, I don't say it just for politeness, but I say it as a premise for deep disagreement with what you said. But I was going to say that in a question. You said, as somebody who's been involved, that Georgia's trajectory in the last 20 or 30 years is for the progress, overall great progress. So my question is, you don't see a fundamental shift in recent years? So a shift towards a situation when we now have a government who blames US and West for wanting to start a war in Georgia and that wants to destroy our identity. So isn't that a fundamental shift? And second and last is, you said there is still a resource to restore normality after elections. And I kind of, maybe I misunderstood, you implied with current status quo, you see a resource of improvement without major political change? Thank you.
Thanks. I see questions for Anna, Alex, and I feel there's something on regime security for you, Fredrik. So why don't we start Anna, Alex, and then Fredrik?
Very short on impunity or dictators or authoritarian regimes. Usually when we speak about these countries, unfortunately, it's not only regime or dictator. When we look on Russia, it is much deeper, and wouldn't like to elaborate on earlier statements of Mr. Whitmore or others. We here in the region, we are well known, we are well aware about Russia's imperial, neo-imperial, and colonial, whatever state order. Whatever, be it Tsarist Russia, Crimean Tatars were in the same situation under Tsars in Soviet Union and now. So no difference to this. Ethnic cleansing and genocide, simply. But it's not only offered by others, but also certain climate inside. Secondly, to Georgi Kandelaki, yes, of course, I used to monitor actions by bureaucracy, but you know, bureaucracy is just external action that is dedicated to fulfill rules and act within the rules. What is necessary is real will of people, of both Western elites, politicians, member states in particular, and allied capitals to act and to collectively formulate certain criteria of action vis-à-vis country like Georgia. Yes, we monitored everything, and once more I repeat, it is will of Georgian people to change it. Probably I see, who knows what kind of scenario there is to take and consistent support from outside, understanding that we do not accept spheres of influence for powers.
Thanks, Anna. Alex, over to you.
Sure, great, thank you. First on Huntington, may not have gotten that exactly right, but the point that I was making there is there were two key elements we have to look at in that test. The first is it peaceful and orderly, which we said it is? And then secondly, does one set of folks in control change place with other set? Those are two key elements. There's a third, which is constitutional. I would argue that the Rose Revolution was less of a revolution than others would say, than other types. So that's a more complicated question about whether you consider it a social revolution or not. But I think at least the term Rose Revolution is a bit overplayed. But having said that, fair point from both of you. I think it is an important point to recognize that ruling groups have changed twice. Shevardnadze to UNM to Georgian Dream, and that is significant. Second point, has there been backsliding? Has there been a negative shift in recent years? Of course. We've talked about that. Many have talked about that. My broader point is that not all that has been built has been lost, and there is a lot with which you can work. You know, the fact that we have this meeting, as others have said, or that civic organizations are still planning on observing these elections, we'll have to see how that goes, is important. And we should take advantage of every opportunity we have to strengthen those democratic institutions and processes. In terms of status quo, obviously we're not looking for a status quo. As many of you may know, USAID, as part of the US government, has put a pause on a certain amount of its assistance, totaling about $95 million, that goes to the government of Georgia. And that's an indication that we want to see certain changes, particularly with regard to the way that it deals with civil society and some of the statements that it's made about the United States and the EU. So we are looking for a change. And one of the risks when you focus on the positive is that folks may not think that you're not acknowledging the negative and the challenges. I wanted to start off by saying I acknowledge those challenges, but it is also important for us to have a positive agenda on what we're trying to achieve. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Fredrik, over to you.
Yes, I mean, to James' question, what can we offer, you know, in terms of regime security to authoritarian regimes? And my short answer is, I hope nothing, because we shouldn't be in that business. But it opens up a sort of wider question that I think we need to show, both in theory and practice from Western liberal democracies, that the key for stability and security is to have legitimately democratically elected governments that change and with respect for human rights and rule of law. And we need to counter this argument, because dictatorships are also based on, you know, we offer stability and we offer security. And I think, you know, empirical evidence, they are stable until they're not stable anymore. And that leads me to my last point on that, is that what I think this rise of authoritarianism has been coupled with a sort of increasing lack in self-confidence in our own values, in our own societies, in Western liberal democracies. And I think this is a serious problem, and we need to talk, not only talk the talk, we need to walk the walk, and also have you know, more self-confidence in our own systems and values, and not trying to deconstruct them from the inside. And I think in relationship to dictatorships, we need to be, you know, we need to have a less of a sort of realist approach, less transactional, less defeatist approach, and actually believe in our own values and have a sort of value-based foreign policy. And that includes holding dictators and violators of international law, holding them accountable, you know, that there will be a day of reckoning coming at some point.
Let me go to Miranda, and then we're going to have a super quick round of questions.
I wanted to bring up, you know, as a journalist, we often see children of kleptocrats. We see people in the inner circle of bad government going to the West and using everything that the West provides you as a privilege. You know, great education, access to medical care. I mean, you know, just name the number of dictators who went to get treatment in Switzerland. If you think about, you know, travels, where do they travel? You know, where do they do their shopping? It's always the same places. And, you know, to effectively deter them, maybe we should cut off some of the access to them, because they don't want to be in the countries they're creating. They want to go abroad. Their children want to go abroad and live abroad. So who they are building country for? If they were building it for their own families and associates, maybe they would take a different approach.
Thanks, Miranda. We got a question from Dan and from Bobo.
First, for Anna Fotyga, let the record show that Poland was right about Russia, including Russian energy, when many others were wrong. So that's one. And for Alex Sokolowski, look, I get where you're coming from. I've been there. But this is government. Georgian Dream Party is running in the elections on an explicit platform to outlaw the opposition. That's like not good. And the Russia law, the law on foreign agents is coming into effect this week. So I get your point. I might even say, in your place, I might even say the same, but please say the same. But please tell me you've got plan B if things go south. Let's not be surprised.
Thank you. Bobo, over to you.
Yes, I want to follow up Fredrik's point about holding authoritarian leaders to account. It's easy when we're talking about Putin or Xi Jinping, or what happens when the authoritarian regimes are, as it were, on our side. So I'm thinking Narendra Modi, Benjamin Netanyahu, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey. and so on and so forth. Or MBS in Saudi Arabia is a classic example. What are you going to do about holding those leaders to account, the friendlies, in other words?
Why don't we have the last question from Gia and then let the panel pick and choose what they want to address?
Okay, my question is the following. Mr. Gvineria, who is our kind of informal monarch, he said on one of the last meetings with the electorate that, of course, we will win. It's just a question of whether constitutional majority or not, and everything will be fine because he meant everything will be fine in relations with the West. So all of these problems with the West are just temporary, and it will improve after we win because they need us no less than we need them. So that were his exact words. So I frankly am a little bit, biased and want opposition to win these elections and even hope it will happen. But if we take this quite dystopian scenario of GD staying in power, destroying civil society, destroying opposition, so will still the United States and Europe need Georgia and develop some kind of good relations based on pragmatic, how you would foresee this scenario?
All right, well, let's go to the panel. Maybe we'll start this way, and any responses and then any concluding remarks. Anna.
Maybe one additional, I'll respond to one thing as well, but one additional remark. We have to remember that nowadays Georgia is quite an important venue in circumvention of sanctions. So I understand that going after kleptocracy may be extremely difficult, and certainly it needs much deeper knowledge and much deeper engagement in this. Secondly, Georgia and other countries of the region are also location of major influx of refugees, whatever that means in case of Russian youth, male youth, escaping country. I think it may be there are many side effects of this. There are thousands of this, so I think it may be difficult. I wanted simply to indicate this quite important issue and influencing daily life of Georgians and also their choices, probably. Secondly, when we speak about holding people accountable, it is, yes, we may say that it is easy to speak about Putin. I'm not quite sure it is so easy. I used to be engaged in doing this for years, and I know how much political background is there for this political will. Now it is much better, but still we discuss special tribunal for the crime of aggression. There are many, of course, problems. Honestly speaking, I'm personally absolutely not a fan of Orban, but honestly, comparing him to perpetrators of war crimes and genocide is going much too far. I still remember, by the way, this long white table put in one side and variety of very credible world leaders talking to him. and many other engagements, by the way. So it would be very complicated to put all of this stuff in same basket.
Thanks. Let's have briefer remarks as we don't want to impose on the other session. Miranda, Fredrik, and Alex.
I just want to comment on Georgian civil society. I think it's quite remarkable that at the time when the foreign agent law was passed, that so many organizations, or just 2% of organizations actually registered, and others are boycotting it. I think it shows the resilience and spirit of Georgian civil society, and I think it's something we should admire and make sure we give them support in the coming weeks as we see how it plays out.
Thanks. Fredrik.
Well, quick answer to Bobo, and I think that's the sort of, Professor Nordia's question was a little bit in the same way. Of course, we will never live in a perfect world, and there will always be policy dilemmas and trade-offs, and states will always interact with other states. But in the bigger picture, I think, we need just to be aware that short-term compromises will come at a long-term price. And when uncertain, it's better to err sort of the sort of more value-based side than on the transactional side. But of course, what I'm saying, we need an inner compass. And when you have sort of policies or analysis of international politics that lacks that compass, that will lead us wrong.
Alex.
Great. So Ambassador Fried's question, first, thank you very much for asking it. Great question, really important. That is one of the things that I would have focused on if I was focusing more at the beginning on the challenges that we face. But absolutely, that kind of language of banning opposition parties is particularly unwelcome in a democracy. Democracy is a key fundamental element, is that you are open to political pluralism and that kind of thing. So absolutely, it's a great point. Per your second point of a question about are we engaged in contingency planning, the quick answer is yes, absolutely, and because you've been on the side of the government side, I can't tell you the details. So, but yes, we are. With regard to Professor Nodia's question on who needs each other more, it's a good question. I'm not sure it matters that much, to be honest with you. What I can say is that over the years, we have had an extremely productive partnership that has brought benefits to both sides. And we'd like to keep that going, but we think that really needs to continue going in the form of Georgia as a democracy moving towards the EU. So that's the dialogue and the efforts that we're engaged in now. It's moved beyond dialogue, as I said earlier. It's moved to measures to encourage the government to move in the right direction.
Thank you. Before I turn over to David, I just want to thank the panel for unpacking these interesting questions, and thank you for being in the audience.
And Vlad, thank you very, very much for a great job of moderating. Thank you, panel. You survived the sun. And everybody stay more or less where you are, because we have the last panel coming up on an issue I think of great interest to everyone, U.S. elections. Thanks. Thank you.
Demic me.
As we're transitioning, we usually save this to the end. second. To close us out for this year's conference is elections in the United States. David Smith with The Guardian is going to lead us in moderating. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm David Smith, Washington Bureau Chief of The Guardian newspaper, which originated in the UK, but now we have offices all over the world, including quite extensively in the US. It's been interesting for me sitting at this conference, looking at the names George W. Bush and John McCain, thinking about the presidential elections in 2000, 2004 with Bush, and 2008 with John McCain, who, as a reporter, he was always very friendly and kind to me. And now we've had 3 more presidential elections since then. And today we're going to talk about the one in 2024, which is getting very close. And we have a great panel. First on my right, Laura Thornton is Senior Director of Global Democracy Programs at the McCain Institute. I know you spent a lot of time in Georgia and previously worked at organizations including the National Democratic Institute. Randy Scheunemann is a strategic counselor at the Halifax International Security Forum, an organization dedicated to increasing strategic cooperation among democracies. Over 3 decades, he's worked on Capitol Hill, at the Pentagon, and on presidential campaigns. Tom Malinowski served 2 terms in the US House of Representatives after winning election in 2018 as a Democrat in New Jersey's historically Republican 7th Congressional District. Previously, as Chief Washington Advocate for Human Rights Watch, he worked with Senator John McCain to end America's use of torture after the 9/11 attacks. And Pedro Bota is Executive Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University in Miami. He's currently collaborating with several international partners to launch a Caucasus Security Studies initiative. We're now 9 weeks away from this all-important presidential election, and if you just go back 9 weeks, we had just had an extraordinary debate where Joe Biden did not do well. Soon after that, we had an assassination attempt against Donald Trump, which he narrowly survived. Then we had Democrats actually changing their nominee, Joe Biden deciding not to run again, and the party consolidating very quickly around Kamala Harris. She chose her running mate. We've had 2 conventions. It's all been pretty extraordinary, and it could result either in the return of Donald Trump or in America's first female president in 248 years of history. So a lot to get into, everybody. Maybe, Laura, I'll start with you. What are your reflections on all of those extraordinary events, and how do you see the state of the race right now?
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be on this feisty panel. It's always the most interesting at the end of this wonderful conference. So you outlined some of the big changes that have come about, and importantly, I think 2 months ago, I would have given you a completely different answer than I would have given you today. I think it was looking like almost a foregone conclusion for Donald Trump. And then the entire race changed before our eyes, where we had Biden stepping down and Harris coming to the plate. You asked me what do I think the state of the play is now. I don't believe it's led to a Harris ahead of Trump situation. It's just evened the playing field. So right now they're within percentage, like a fraction margin of error in several swing states, which is what matters. And what I'm really looking at actually is an issue that maybe is not as much about the campaigns, but more about the quality of the elections and belief in elections, which is something that we look into at the McCain Institute. So one of the concerns I have, for example, are some of the laying of the groundwork that's taking place in certain states that might make a certification of an election complicated. So to give a quick example before I turn over to folks who can speak more freely, partisanly, in Georgia, for example, the election board has recently appointed what we call election deniers. These are people...
State of Georgia.
State of Georgia, not this Georgia. We can talk about fake electors here, maybe, but yeah, state of Georgia. And they have appointed these election deniers, people that deny the results of the 2020 elections. And they're part of a process by a group called the Election Integrity Project, which sounds lovely, but really what it is trying to put in place people that will challenge results that they don't like. And what that means in practice is that, for example, in a constituency in Georgia, someone on the board can be like, I'm not sure, and it opens up an investigation process. Why that's important is because it can sail through deadlines. So you could, in theory, be in a position where they don't meet the deadline for the state, for the Secretary of State to endorse it, and then you don't meet the deadline to report to the federal government, so you have what we would call chaos. It would probably go to the courts, but more importantly, the aim of this would be to kick up dust, to kick up uncertainty in the process. And because our elections in the United States are this thin a margin and come down to a few thousand votes in certain states, this kind of interference could be really problematic. So that's something that we're tracking. And of course, the other thing that we're looking really closely at the McCain Institute is the role that information plays. And obviously, we've examined, in my previous job at GMF, the role of foreign actors, but also the prevalence of disinformation that is domestically driven. And a lot of that disinformation is about the election process. So if you're flooding the zone with distrust in the most fundamental process of democracy, and 70% of Republicans still have questions, I just looked that up just to make sure I was right, still doubt the legitimacy of the 2020 elections. To go into an election that's this tight, with this much lack of trust, with efforts being made to sow even more discord, is what gives me concern and what I'm looking at.
Randy, in your political experience, have you ever seen an election year quite like this, and how do you view the state of the race at the moment?
No, it's been incredible for all the reasons you outlined in terms of the rapid changes. I mean, we had a situation where it was a race between a felon and a fossil, and now it's a race between a felon and somebody who is reinventing herself on an almost daily basis. State of the race, as Laura pointed out, is extremely close. In those 6 or 7 key swing states, virtually all of them are within the margin of error. And if previous polling holds true, that is in 2016 and 2020, Trump wins. Trump underpolls. For a variety of reasons, pollsters have tried to figure it out. They've tried to adjust from, how many Republicans they include, factor in that polling's changed. Very few people have landlines now, but Trump underpolls, and that's the state of the race, I think, right now from the polling standpoint. From the kind of political overview, Trump this time around has got a much more experienced team around him. Susan Wiles and Chris LaCivita are pros. It was chaos last time, in 2016 especially. But he's not listening to him because he's Trump. And so he'll veer off the script as he often does. In the case of Harris, what I think should concern those who want to see Harris win is she's not had a track record of running a successful campaign before, to put it mildly. When she ran for president last time, she didn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses. And second, she's an incumbent running when the country has a very high right track, wrong track, i.e. wrong track direction. And she's got a record that she is changing on an almost daily basis in an effort to move to the center. which is classic. And classic, you have time to do that after winning the nomination. But in this compressed time frame we have, she's trying to do it in a very short period of time. She's running what I would call trying to run an Obama hope and change race in 2024. And when Obama ran it successfully in 2008, you had an incumbent president with a very unpopular war and at the end an economic crash. So the big question is, can the hope and change and lack of policy specifics and changes running to the middle beat the erratic, sometimes irrational, Trump grievance-driven campaign? And I don't think anybody knows right now.
And it's interesting how so far Trump hasn't managed to find a line of attack that sticks. And I noticed the latest nickname is Comrade Kamala, and trying to portray her as a communist. We'll see how that goes. Tom, obviously you're a Democrat and been in Congress, the Democrats and so on. So I wonder, when you saw that Joe Biden debate, did you join the Democrats who were calling for him to step aside? And are you glad that he did make way for Kamala Harris?
Yes and yes.
Right.
I did right away. And I'll agree and maybe disagree with a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it has been wild, and the only credible explanation I can think of for what we've experienced in the last 2 months is that we are living in a television show. It is season 8 of this drama, and in episode 10 we had the events that you described, the old standard bearer of the Democratic Party stumbling catastrophically in a debate, the bad guy narrowly almost being martyred by an assassin's bullet, and at the end of that episode we all went to bed thinking this is going to be a terrible ending. But really what the writers were doing were setting up episode 11, in which the Democrats changed their candidates, something that has never happened in the history of the United States at this late stage. And because this is an American television show, the ending will be happy. In episode 12. And of course, I'm not 100% certain. I am a realist, and I see both sides of that question. But I am relatively optimistic, because the campaign that Trump wanted to run, well, let me put it this way. The one thing that most Americans agreed on going into this election was they did not want a rerun of 2020. They didn't want another dispiriting campaign between old Biden and old Trump. And that meant that there was a huge advantage to whichever party broke from that pattern and gave them something new. The campaign Trump wanted to run in that old former situation was strength versus weakness, and in American politics, strong and wrong tends to beat weak and right. But he can't run that race anymore. This is now a race between new and old. And yes, she is an incumbent, but so is Trump. That makes this a very, very weird situation. But she has been able, with a lot of discipline that she didn't show in 2020, to establish herself as the candidate of the future, the candidate of youth, the candidate that just wants to move past all the stuff that we've hated about American politics for the last few years. So if the election were held today, I would predict that she would win. I think the compressed campaign actually helps dramatically. What worries me is that there's still 2 months left. And so I think episode 12 is the season, and I hope series finale. But I don't know how many more episodes the writers have in store for us. Anything could still happen, so stay tuned.
Yeah, I mean, I think the showrunner will have ordered an October surprise at least. Yeah. That's what always happens.
Well, we've had 2. Maybe just before October.
Even October.
Yeah, no, of course the final episode can't be that boring, right?
Right.
There has to be some intrigue.
And part of the point you make, of course, is that this American presidential election is much more like a European election in terms of the time span. You know, normally these things go on for years, and this is a sprint to the finish.
So most Americans, when the switch happened, many of my Democratic colleagues who did not want Biden to step down argued this is not possible because there are only 3 or 4 months left. And my response was, you don't understand. That is my worry. I wish there were only 3 weeks left. And there's no reason why we have to do it this way in America. I mean, I can explain why, given our First Amendment, you can't limit campaigns. The Supreme Court says you can't limit donations. So you can't stop people from running from 2 years. But there's no reason why we can't do what we seem to be doing quite successfully right now. That's having a compressed campaign where people are paying attention. They will decide quickly.
Pedro, what are your thoughts on this election? And perhaps could you talk a bit about what do you see as the most important issues that are going to decide how people vote? Is it immigration, especially at the US-Mexico border? Is it the economy, especially the rate of inflation? Or is it also abortion rights, given the Supreme Court overturned the national constitutional right to abortion a couple of years ago?
I think all those issues are at the table, for sure. Immigration is a big problem. It doesn't ever seem to get fixed. We are waiting. I live in Miami, and we're waiting for the next wave of Venezolanos after the stolen election to come. Border security, Republicans killed that bipartisan bill. It doesn't ever seem to get resolved. Abortion, I think, the Roe v. Wade issue, I think is big. And I think the Republicans and this push for limiting abortion rights, access to abortion, I think they've just gone too far. And I think that that's going to backfire on them. I think people that probably were somewhat in their camp, I think this particular issue just went too far. And I think a lot of the things that they're doing, has gone too far. And one of the conversations I had this morning, in Florida, the state of Florida, our governor, Ron DeSantis, he's been on this book banning binge for quite some time. And one of the more conservative counties in Florida, it's an affluent county, but exceedingly conservative, Escambia County, Pensacola. The county has banned 1,600 books from public libraries and public schools. And so these conservative parents have gotten together and launched a lawsuit against the county. So we're seeing these extreme positions just backfiring. Also in the county where I live, Miami-Dade County, the candidates that DeSantis endorsed for school board, all lost. So they take these positions and then go too far, and then there's the reaction. So yes, I think these issues are definitely on people's minds. Also, the economy, right now the inflation, it's really, really crushing the average American, So I think that, yes, although, Biden has done an amazing job turning things around, 14 million jobs and, quite a turnaround there. However, inflation is still an issue, and people don't understand, where it's coming from. It's like, oh, Joe Biden hasn't done anything to fix this. So that is a huge issue. And then if I will, just to add a little bit to the story, I'm also very optimistic about Kamala Harris. And the reason is I've recently become a disciple of Alan Lichtman. And I've bored a bunch of people with this story already, but, he looks at US presidential elections more as a referendum of the governing that occurred in those previous 4 years. And so he doesn't pay a lot of attention to the hoopla and histrionics of campaigns. And he says very clearly, don't pay attention to polls. Polls are snapshots in the moment. And the example he gave, the classic example he gives always, Hillary Clinton. What a shock to all of us when we woke up the next day and she had lost and the polls had been in her favor. So he really his methodology is very interesting, and I don't want to take a lot of time getting into it because it would require some time. But he's looking at historical factors, and he says that is what determines how did the incumbent party perform. And so looking at those historical factors, he can come up with, yes, there's qualitative judgment involved, but he can come up with a reasonable prediction. And he's been successful ever since he started this. It's 1984 to 2020. He's nailed it.
I interviewed him a few weeks ago. Alan Lichtman is an academic at American University in Washington, and yes, he says he's got every election right since 1984, although in 2000 he did predict Al Gore, and he still maintains that technically he thinks Al Gore did win.
Let me defend him.
We won't go into that now.
Let me defend him. What happened to Al Gore? It was the debacle in Florida, Really, the debacle in Florida. We'll never know, but, votes were not counted in Florida.
And we've not had his official prediction yet for this year, but he seems to be...
It's coming.
He seems to be leaning towards Harris. You wanted to comment on something?
Yeah. Yeah, just to respond on the issues thing. Well, first of all, on the polling thing, actually, the polls were right nationally about Hillary Clinton because they had her ahead 3%, and she won 3% of the popular vote. Where they were wrong were in the swing states. And on the issues, I totally agree. I mean, but it's not just abortion. It has become a much bigger package of misogyny that is being peddled by the candidates. We're talking about reproductive health. Although Trump is doing this crazy back flipping on this issue, and he's not landing it quite well. But it's talking about broader reproductive health. It's talking about in vitro fertilization. It's talking about measures. We have in Texas measures that are trying to prevent women from traveling across a border. I don't know how they would enforce that. They're talking, this is not Trump, but parts of the campaigns that are taking place in the United States are talking about tracking devices for women's menstrual cycles. This is an insane package, and then you have a vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party who can hardly get through a day without insulting women, whether it's insulting childless cat ladies or talking about postmenopausal women whose only role is to take care of children. So this issue is going to affect the majority of the population, which are women, but also men that support women and support their reproductive rights. The other issue on the economy, I think, is the killer issue. But just back to my point on information and facts. 60% of Americans believe that the stock market is at an all-time low. It's at an all-time high. People believe that unemployment has never been higher. It's never been lower. People believe that inflation is going up. Inflation's going down. Prices are high. So there is a lot of misunderstanding even on those fundamental issues that will affect choice when going into the election.
Just on the gender points you were talking about, so I think the polls show at the moment we're set for an all-time historic gender divide. Trump has a lead among men, Harris has a bigger lead among women, and bearing in mind those ghosts of 2016 and Hillary Clinton, and this one is for anybody, to put it bluntly, is America ready to elect a woman as president? And
did.
And the popular vote, but not the electoral college.
We're ready.
Yeah. Not only a woman, but a woman of color.
Yes. No. Yeah. I don't. It's less of an issue than it was in 2016.
And notably, Harris is talking about it far less than Hillary Clinton did. Hillary Clinton talked about, I'm going to break the glass ceiling. There's all of I'm with her. Harris is deliberately avoiding forefronting that subject.
She doesn't engage in all. When, the whole, and I have a beef with the media in how they, no offense, but how they cover this sometimes. Because Trump made a comment, for example, that Kamala Harris turned black. And when the media pressed Kamala Harris, she's like, same old story, next question. She is not engaging in gender politics or racial politics. But the headline that I saw was, Kamala Harris evades question on when she turned black.
That was a bad one. That was, yeah, I saw that one. That was not good. Moving on, and maybe we'll start with Pedro and work this way on this one. Just interested, not least because where we are, we could talk a bit about foreign policy. And this is kind of three questions in one in a way. What have you thought of Joe Biden's record overseas when you think about Afghanistan and Gaza and Ukraine, obviously? And then do you see Harris as a continuity, or will she break on some issues? And certainly the left, for example, are pressuring her to take a different stance on Gaza. And then the third component of that question is, what would a return of Donald Trump look like? You know, we hear about some countries so-called Trump-proofing themselves in readiness for his potential return. And one thinks, you know, particularly Ukraine, obviously watching very closely what might happen with Trump in the White House and with his right-hand man, J.D. Vance, who I think is on the record at one point saying, I don't care about Ukraine.
Well, I think, yes, I think, you know, the global stage is the wild card, you know, because things happen that are just out of our control, out of the control of a sitting president of the United States. And so I think that where I see Joe Biden doing well is kind of reversing that America First approach that Trump had and willing to engage, you know, with allies and partners and have conversations. And so I think Kamala Harris is going to continue this trend, definitely an appeal to multilateralism. You know, I think she's going to embrace more, you know, the conversation on climate change. You know, I think they'll put human rights and democracy back in the forefront. And I think there'll be quite a bit of work on global health, you know. So I really see, you know, Joe Biden really had to undo a lot of things when he stepped in. And I think he's done that, and I think Kamala Harris is going to, you know, take it further. And Trump will echo what he did in the first term, you know, the America First approach, you know, and, you know, transactional diplomacy, unconventional diplomacy. You know, he seems to like to engage these characters, these nefarious characters. I think that's going to be his playbook. You know, I don't see any kind of change in that.
There certainly is the fear among some that he will not have the more responsible players around him next time, you know, the McMasters and
this is it.
All those sort of people.
As Kamala Harris said in her acceptance speech, imagine Trump without the guardrails.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know?
Tom, what are your thoughts on those points?
Sure. So, I'm a Democrat. I didn't vote for the guys whose names are up there, Bush and McCain, though McCain was a dear friend. But had this conference been taking place in 2000, 2004, 2008, and you'd asked me this question, I would have said you have nothing to worry about. I have, personally, I might have wanted a different outcome than some people, but in terms of American foreign policy, there would be broadly continuity in support of NATO, in support of our alliances, in opposition to dictatorships like Russia and China. And from the standpoint of a country like Georgia, the difference would not have been great enough for you to be that concerned. I wish I could say that today, but obviously it's completely different. I have some disagreements with Joe Biden on foreign policy, but broadly speaking, he is governed in the tradition that we have come to admire and respect from good American leaders. He mobilized more global support for Ukraine, for example, than the total cost of the Marshall Plan for all the countries of Europe after the Second World War. That is a significant achievement. And a Harris administration would continue in that direction, I think perhaps even more forcefully. Whereas Trump would be, as you suggested, unbound, no guardrails. Remember in his final couple of weeks in office, when he no longer had the Mattises and McMasters, he fired his Secretary of Defense, Mike Esper, and the reason given for firing Mike Esper was that he was always talking about Russia, and trying to stop President Trump from withdrawing our troops from Europe. So I think that's where he would pick up. One more point on this. The conventional wisdom in the United States is that none of these issues matter in an election, that foreign policy does not matter in an election. To some extent, that is true. But foreign policy, I think, does matter if it reflects, if it reveals something about the character and values of the people who are running, and in this case it does. And I think these issues in particular are going to matter to a group of Americans who happen to be, and this is one of the wonderful things about this television show we're living in, who happen to be concentrated in the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and that is Polish, Ukrainian, and other East European Americans. Traditionally, they would probably lean towards the Republicans in an election like this, but there's good data, this is not just my wishful thinking, there's good data that shows that the argument that Trump will encourage Putin to do, as Trump said, whatever the hell he wants to our allies in Central Europe, and that Harris will stand by NATO and stand up to Putin, is a very powerful argument with these voters. And so wouldn't that be an interesting ending if 10,000 Ukrainian Americans in Pennsylvania decide this election? It is not at all impossible.
And Tom, with your ex-congressman hat on, I just wonder if I could ask a follow-up, which is, what do you think a Trump victory could mean for Ukraine? Obviously, a while back, after much delay, Congress did pass that latest package of security assistance. It dragged on for a while. It got done. Would Trump just embrace isolationism and cut Ukraine loose, or does the Congress still wield enough power and influence to actually change his mind or force it through?
The Congress still matters, but remember that even out of office, merely as the candidate of the Republican Party, Trump and his MAGA movement prevented the House of Representatives from acting for 6 months, even though 60% or more of Americans support Ukraine, even though most Republicans privately in Congress support Ukraine. And the result of that was thousands of Ukrainians died and territory was lost. So I'm not like, oh, they passed it in the end anyway, so we're fine. That was not fine. That was awful. It was absolutely a horrible thing. And Trump, as president, he has made clear where his affinities lie. He wonders, why can't we get along with Russia? Why can't we get along with Putin? He doesn't understand the value of NATO. He doesn't understand why a small country fighting for freedom should matter to the United States. There will still be struggle over this question. It's not like we're all going to give up and let him do whatever he wants. But I don't think we're going to get another $60 billion aid package for Ukraine. And you can all extrapolate from that in terms of what it will mean for diplomacy and for the outcome of the war.
Randy, interested in your take on these foreign policy issues, perhaps including the question of what is this strange affinity between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin we've seen over the years?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, foreign policy generally plays, and I agree with Tom on that point, not a central role generally in presidential elections, but a complementary role. It can play an important role. It did in, the missile gap in 1960 between Nixon and Kennedy. It certainly did in a strength-weakness kind of role between Reagan and Carter in 1980. But let me step back for a second and say, whoever wins, there's reason to worry on foreign policy. I mean, we've seen multiple administrations now interested in withdrawing from the world. I mean, it's Barack Obama who said, "Come home, America." I've got to disagree fundamentally with something Tom said in 2008. It doesn't matter here who would have won the election. And I speak as someone who was John McCain's top foreign policy advisor in the 2008 campaign, in full disclosure. The Obama administration came in, and the first thing they did was reset with Russia, which was basically, don't worry about that invasion in Georgia. We want to get along with Russia. Hugely damaging. The Obama administration refused to provide lethal military equipment to either Georgia or Ukraine, which, by the way, Donald Trump's administration, for all of his shameful performance at the Helsinki press conference, his administration did, in part because he had people like Pompeo, Mattis, and others, which you wouldn't have this time around. But there is reason to worry. First of all, let's not whitewash the historical record here of the Biden administration. Does anybody really think the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan didn't have an impact on Putin's calculation about what he could get away with in Ukraine? Actions matter, and I don't want to get it. I'm happy to get into a debate over, oh, this was negotiated under Trump and all that. The reality is that horribly mismanaged withdrawal that also led not just to the deaths of Americans in the Abbey Gate bombing, but the abandonment of thousands of Afghans who risked their lives to work with us over the course, us and our NATO partners and allies over the course of that war, had a huge impact. And if you think, let me just give you one data point on a Harris administration. Most of you know who Phil Gordon is. He's a friend of mine. I've known him for years. Phil Gordon was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe in the reset time of the Obama administration. He's the one that canceled missile defense, responsible for that decision and communicating it in Poland and the Czech Republic. And for all of you that remember that decision and think about what if we had more effective missile defenses now, it might be a little different. And I like Phil, but he's very cautious. I'm concerned about what a Harris administration would be. And finally, on the Biden administration and Ukraine, yes, he did mobilize allies, but also, yes, he has put limitations and delay on almost every single weapon system. And to Bill Taylor's point yesterday, they finally said the magic P word, prevail, in some statement at the very end of a sentence somewhere. Where's the speech mobilizing the country on Ukraine? Where's the speech saying for 2% of our defense budget, we've crippled the military of one of our major geopolitical adversaries? Haven't seen it.
And we're about to take audience questions, so ask for relative brevity, but Laura, I wonder if I could ask, as part of this as well, how important is it for this global struggle we've heard about between democracies and autocracies that America passes this stress test? To bring us full circle, what you were talking about at the beginning, that this election runs freely and fairly and doesn't culminate in another January the 6th?
Yeah, well, first, brevity on the foreign policy. I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think for Harris, she's so new in the race, and so detecting her foreign policy plans is a little tricky. Although, if you listen to her at the Democratic National Convention, I'm sorry, that sounded like John McCain to me. It was forceful, it was robust, it talked about lethal, which got a lot of lefties kind of upset. So that was interesting. And another thing about foreign policy that we should keep in mind in a Trump administration is I did the great disservice to myself of reading the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which I took one for the team. And Trump has distanced himself from this, but if you look at the people involved in that and the people involved in designing his campaign and who's also served under Trump, one of the key points I noticed among many things in the foreign policy section is, again, really increasing the power of the executive, which other presidents have done, both Democratic and Republican, but in such a way that, for example, getting rid of service ambassadors, making sure they're all political appointments, doing ideology tests at USAID, including for lower levels to make sure that they're implementing a conservative, anti-choice, et cetera, aid package. So, and really reducing and really increasing the executive's control over all aspects of embassies and development aid. So to the question about where do we stand in the fight against democracy and autocracy, obviously the world looks at the United States, and certainly when we had problems in our elections, it supports autocrats around the world. We even see things like Stop the Steal. It's like the new black. it's jumping from one place to another. The election, I lost the elections, therefore they were stolen. You heard it from Israel to Burma. So I think we unfortunately often set very good examples, and we can also set very bad examples. So I'm hoping we do not have another January 6th. I think President Biden would call the National Guard if someone was storming the Capitol. Kamala Harris is proceeding, and we did reform the Electoral Reform Act with both Republicans and Democrats, so hopefully we don't have messiness there. So I am a glass half full kind of gal, and hoping that things go smoothly, but I can't guarantee.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Gentleman over there, the striped shirts. Yep. Thank you.
Randy? Yeah, right. Randy, I agree with you that the foreign policy record of the Biden administration has been massively overrated. But I wondered whether you could say something about how, come 5 November, Donald Trump is elected President of the United States. How will US foreign policy look under Trump 2.0?
You want to take
it? Go for it. Yeah, thank you.
So, as pointed out by our esteemed moderator, you will not have the loyalty tests that are being performed now that they tried to impose late Trump administration are being imposed. So you won't have, as I mentioned, the guardrails of Mattis, Pompeo, et cetera, McMaster, Bolton, and you might not like John Bolton, but he was, so
I like him more now than I used to.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Now, having said that, not everybody is going to be a Kash Patel crazy necessarily, and Kash Patel is nuts. For those of you that don't know him, he's Trump tried to make him CIA director in the last months of the administration, and the whole CIA leadership threatened to quit. He probably isn't confirmable, but there's a lot of those folks around. Rick Grenell's kind of a wild card, to put it mildly, for any Germans here. You had the misfortune of dealing with him as ambassador to Germany. But there will be some decent people. Robert O'Brien, who was National Security Advisor, will be in the mix, and he's managed to stay in the good graces of Trump and Trump world, while being a rather mainstream Republican, one of the few, and there's some others. Trump is likely to pick a senator or two for positions, and so if you have a Tom Cotton or a Marco Rubio sitting in a cabinet position. Now, having said all that, Trump without guardrails, Trump never having to face electoral decision again, is even more unpredictable than Trump first time with no guardrails. Who knows what he would do? He doesn't even know what he would do. I mean, when he starts a speech, he doesn't know what he's going to say 10 minutes in. But without the guardrails, I see my friend Hero out there. Trump in 1987 took out a full-page ad in a number of newspapers, including the Washington Post, trashing implicitly the Reagan administration, but really all post-Cold War foreign policy, saying Japan didn't pay enough. Japan did fine in the first Trump administration, principally because our unfortunately departed Prime Minister Abe figured out how to handle him. I'm not sure another Japanese leader could figure that out. So Japan, Taiwan, who Trump said, by the way, ought to be paying us insurance because we're protecting them. Huge problem. And I didn't really address your point before. I can't explain his affinity for Putin any more than I can explain Obama's reset, and I'm not trying to score a cheap political point there. Some of Trump's policies were okay first term. I don't think as many will be okay second term.
I think lots of people already have microphones, so whoever has, yep.
Yeah. Today we talked about the importance of Georgia's elections and how it impacts not only what happens here, but the world. You've talked about ethnic communities in the United States and the swing states. A bit of data is that Georgian diaspora is numerous in some of these swing states, particularly Pennsylvania and Florida. So it'll be interesting to see what role they will play. And the question that I have for Randy particularly, if Trump were to return, what would the NATO enlargement look like? We know what his policies are in terms of contributions of member states towards the budget. But how small is his appetite to further NATO enlargement? Thank you.
To the extent you can predict, extremely small. I mean, what are we talking about with NATO enlargement? We're talking about Georgia, depending on what happens in the election, but we're really talking about Ukraine. On Ukraine, I think an opportunity was missed, and I said so, wrote a piece with Evelyn Farkas saying at the Vilnius summit, there should have been a clear roadmap laid out. That was a missed opportunity. Washington, I think, was too late. But you look at the makeup of the Senate, and we will have a new Senate. We haven't talked about any of the other elections. We'll have a third of the senators are up for election. We'll have some new senators. Getting to ratification for Ukraine would be extremely difficult. I think if there's a Trump administration, won't even have to worry about getting to ratification because there won't be any push from the United States to do so. Just like in Vilnius, it was unfortunately the United States blocking the desires of many NATO member countries to do a lot more on membership for Ukraine.
Any more questions? The gentleman has the mic, yep.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Dino Toderashko, GMF. Regarding the foreign policy that the next administrations will or will not address certain regions of the Black Sea region, you mentioned Ukraine, and I was wondering whether you have any opinion on Moldova, because Moldova is on the front line of, let's say, the will for this region to break free from the interference from Kremlin and become a full-fledged EU member state. As you probably know, Moldova, since the break of the war, hosted quite a numerous number of Ukrainian refugees. It opened its borders, its homes as well. So Moldova will be facing presidential elections October 20th, together with a crucial referendum on EU integration, as well as parliamentary elections in 2025. So I was wondering whether Moldova is also viewed and thought as an important country that should be supported in its fight for independence and democracy.
Just before we start, we just pass the microphone. Hero is your name, isn't it, I believe, sir? Just for the final question. Sorry, Moldova, any takers on?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if it's Trump, and I hope it won't be, I think it won't be, but if it's Trump, he's never heard of Moldova, and he will have no opinion about Moldova unless it affects his interest personally in some way. If it's Harris, I get a lot of questions about what's going to be her foreign policy towards this or that country or issue. Can you talk to her people now? And one aspect of this compressed campaign is she does not have a policy, much less foreign policy, but a policy apparatus attached to the campaign. When Barack Obama was running in 2018, I was involved in that. The campaign was a year and a half long. There were committees for every region of the world, position papers, policy papers. None of that is happening. So we don't know. What we do know is that she comes from the tradition that we are accustomed to, that she is positioning herself, if anything, on the more robust side of the Biden administration on these issues. Her main foreign policy advisor, you heard from Randy Phil Gordon. My sense of him is that he is fairly forward-leaning. I don't want to say much more than that, but I think he's someone who believes that when you're in a fight, you should be fighting to prevail in that fight. You should be serious about it rather than trying to take half measures. So I think there would be a lot of sympathy for any democratic country that is facing a threat from Russia, whether it's Georgia, which will hopefully be a democracy, Moldova, Ukraine, or others.
So one quick point I wanted to make is so much hinges on what happens in Ukraine, for the rest of the region. And so we can't take our eye off of that outcome. Ukraine cannot lose this war.
you're here.
One more question, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So, is it on?
Yep.
Yeah. So my question is about the TV drama. Yeah, I like
drama.
American TV drama because we really believe that it is always happy end. But this TV drama, American TV drama, continues maybe like until series 100 or series 200. So my question is, let's say within 5 years or 10 years, my question is what will happen to a Trump phenomenon? So happy end scenario of this TV drama, series 100, is that after all, Mr. Trump is a cult. And when cult disappear, people wake up and back to a normal life. Or normal division will remain, but it is normal division or polarization. So this is a happy end. But the unhappy end is that Mr. Trump cult disappear, but since he's a symptom, so there is an income gap and the tension among the races and so on. So another cult appears, and then another series will start. So which do you think is more likely?
That's a fascinating question, and it's a reminder, sort of the aftermath of this election is going to be extraordinary, particularly if Republicans lose. Where does Donald Trump go? Can the Republican Party return to the era of George W. Bush and John McCain? And perhaps we'll work along the line, and then we'll have to finish your thoughts on that and any other closing remarks.
Yeah, I think, the Trump phenomenon, it's part of a bigger story, the whole kind of this populism, that has kind of gripped the world. And you just keep reacting to it. We keep reacting to it. So Trump will go away. Will those sentiments and those ideas, will those go away? No, it's the human condition, So we just muddle through, keep pushing forward, doing the right thing. So.
Well, let me start with the short term. If he loses, he will not accept his defeat. And there will be maybe an epilogue, I hope, about that drama.
Spin-off series.
Spin-off series. You mentioned potential problems in our great southern state of Sakartvelo, which many of you know as Georgia. But I do think we will get past that. I share your optimism. I think most Americans, especially if there's violence, I think they will be disgusted by it. I don't think they're going to buy, most Americans, an argument that the election was stolen. And hopefully that will contribute to what we hoped would happen after January 6th. The system moving back to something that feels more normal. My fear is that as long as the person of Donald Trump is out there, even defeated, then we are going to have to contend with his MAGA movement. And my fear is that unless we deal with some of the structural problems, and I personally think the central structural problem is what's happened to the way in which we get information about the world around us. It is a problem rooted in our technology companies and how they are allowed to do business that we will have to confront in a very, very serious way. Until we deal with that, we are going to be experiencing more drama.
I agree with Tom on some of the structural concerns. Look, if Trump goes away and doesn't decide to stay in the game and run again in 2028, which we can all hope doesn't happen, I would hope, as a Republican who came to Washington in the 1980s to fight the Cold War, inspired by Ronald Reagan, that the Republican Party can then start to have the serious internal debate we need to have about the future of the party and confront what used to just be Senator Rand Paul, but now is J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley and a number of others on the appropriate role in the world. Trump selecting Vance gives him, even in a losing role, a much more, unfortunately, a much more important voice in that debate. But he won't be the only one, because there's still a lot of internationalist Republicans out there, ranging from, you know, Mitch McConnell, who's in the final years of serving in office, to the two likely successors to him as Senate leaders, John Thune and John Cornyn. I mean, there's a lot of internationalist Republicans in the House as well. And I look forward to engaging in that debate because I have every confidence that we can win that debate, because in a dangerous world, the way to move forward is not to denigrate your allies and write love letters to your adversaries in North Korea.
No, I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I love the idea of a sort of come to Jesus within the Republican Party. Randy and I were talking last night. It's almost like Vichy versus de Gaulle, and like the real Republican Party's here, and there's been this, as you said, 2 years ago here, hostile takeover. But I agree really with Pedro, because we focus so much on the supply, and certainly the elixir of the charismatic Trump is important, but there's a demand problem. And it's not just in the United States, we're seeing it around the world, where people want autocrats. They vote for them. I just looked at the World Values Survey, and up to 50% of Americans say that a strong man would be preferable to messy democracy. If you look at Morning Consult and measures of far-right authoritarianism across Europe and the United States, you see these numbers rising. People are less interested in liberal democracy, and that is where, and Tom is right, part of it's absolutely information and living in a poisoned information landscape that feeds these lies that lead them to think a strong man is the answer. But part of them are very real values and cultural cleavages that our society faces, and a vision for what our society should look like. Should it be a multicultural, pluralistic, diverse democracy that focuses on freedoms and liberties, or do we go back to a time? Do we go back to tradition and preservation and nativism, where there were real clear pecking orders of power and privilege? And so I think, regardless of Trump, we need to detox our societies from this ill.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, everybody. And in Tom's TV drama, tune in next week for the next episode. It's Trump versus Harris in the presidential debate. So that will be interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You can stay right there. Stay right there. David, thank you very much for a great moderating job. As you can see, politics in any country can bring out some real passion. It's probably a good time to remind everyone that both the George W. Bush Institute and the McCain Institute are 501c3 organizations, which means we are nonpartisan, but we do welcome very vibrant discussion and debate about what's going on. As we were sitting here for this last panel, headline came across my phone: Russian strike on Ukrainian city kills at least 41 in Poltava. So as we are discussing and debating all of these issues, the war against freedom continues. And those of us in the democracy world need to do a much better job of defending our freedom and never take it for granted, and support those who are very much on the front lines and paying a deadly price every single day. This has been a terrific conference, ended with an excellent conversation about the United States. We covered an awful lot of ground, and we did it in a beautiful setting, even if it was a little warm. But grateful. This is the largest crowd I think we've had till the end of past conferences. So really grateful to all of you for sticking with us throughout these 2 days. And also I do want to recognize, because it has not happened every year, but huge thanks to my fellow panelists and moderators for being here pretty much throughout the entire conference. Thank you for showing that solidarity and support. As I said in the beginning, this conference would not happen without this person. And so let me turn the microphone over to Nina to say a few words.
Thank you so much, David, and dear friends, again, it was like amazing 2 days and very interesting and very powerful discussions. And you mentioned that what is going right now in Ukraine, and I wish this 2024 a pivotal year. We should make this pivot as a victory of Ukraine and the free world. And it's, that without this, no one is going to survive. Without victory of Ukraine, there is no victory of Georgia and other freedom fighters on this world. And with this, I would like to express my gratitude to all our donors who were supporting this conference all these years, last 10 years. We missed the 2 of them because of COVID. And these people are US Embassy to Tbilisi, USAID UNAC program, and USAID Good Governance Program, Open Society Foundations, Civil Society Foundations, Rooms Hotel, of course, the Stamba and the D Block and the TBC Bank. And I would like to express my gratitude to our a very creative and a very great team who every year makes a very different a setting of this tricolor studio. And thank you so much for this. And of course, our EPRC outstanding team, Irina, Tamara, Shota, Zaza, Nata, Tedo, and all these people who are doing this conference every year. And last but not least, because we have to be very grateful to this very bravest man who is a mastermind of this conference. And I cannot do not only this conference, anything else without him. Thank you, David. Thanks a lot. Being with the people of Georgia and being not only with the people of Georgia, but the people who were struggling and fighting for freedom and the independence of this kind of different countries and the democracy everywhere. Thank you. Hope to see you soon in next year.
So for speakers and participants, speakers and moderators, we will meet here at 7:30 for the final dinner and entertainment. So please do come on time. We've stuck to the time pretty well. So thank you all very much.